Alrighty, and we're live. Welcome, viewer. This may be the most important live stream of your life. Bevry's recent live streams have been covering the roles of propaganda, identity, and mimetic warfare, which is how we came across our guest today, Matt Pirkowski, who provided a formal definition of mimetic parasitism, which we'll go over later in the interview. Matt has also interviewed the minds of Jordan Peterson and Jordan Greenhall on his own YouTube channel. Matt comes across immediately as an articulate, deep, and clear thinker, more so than me, we can see, who we are honored to share and query his wisdom on our channel today. And who are we? I'm Ben, a software engineer and the founder of Bevry. I built software that is installed millions of times each month and created content on YouTube that has a year of view time now. I'm joined today by John, an autodidact philosopher and screenwriter of The Anti-Natalist, which you can view on this Bevry channel. John also led the recent Bevry series, which is exploring the Vaki's awakening from the meaning crisis. I'm also joined today by Nick, co-participant of Paul Vanderklay's channel and a constant mimetic transgressor, as well as Tyler, Bevry member for many years now and co-admin of Eric Weinstein's Portal server. Together, we are part of Bevry, an open company comprised of a study department, which includes this weekly show that uncovers objective truth so we can keep our axioms aligned towards it. Bevry is also comprised of a build department, which develops projects and products that will further the expansion of collaborative wisdom. So let's get started. So Matt, welcome to the Bevry channel. Give us a overview of who you are.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks a lot for having me. In terms of who I am, I guess it's probably easiest in terms of describing, fundamentally what I care about. And at the moment, I think I care most about trying to understand how we align our, the aspects of our human psychology and our evolved psyche with the tools that we've created and the tools that have sort of encompassed our entire lives. So especially the technological variants of those tools, the internet, our computers, our software systems, and how those interact with our own psychology, our own evolved neurological mechanisms, and how that scales up or fails to scale up. As we see now, we're in quite a chaotic time, and what I really care most about is trying to figure out how to find a way through that using whatever tools are necessary, whether that's new linguistic tools, new technological tools, new interpersonal tools. That's what I care about, and that's sort of who I am at the moment. If in terms of my background economically, I got very interested in these things back in college when I was researching primates. I worked with capuchin monkeys, doing some trading behavior, trying to understand things like prospect theory in terms of there are these ideas of irrational behavior. We use that word. What does it actually mean to discuss something like rationality versus irrationality? And one way to study that is to understand how far that goes back in our evolutionary history. Seeing the fact that these primates who diverged, or from whom we diverged millions of years ago, seeing these behaviors in them and seeing our own humanity reflected in these places, made a massive impact on me and really led me to try to understand what it would mean for these types of behaviors to continue evolving, not just with the evolutionary biology that had been driving them for quite some time, but also when you start layering on all of these technological layers. And so then I became very interested in software and the interaction between software and the human biological hardware. That led me into the software industry. I worked for multiple companies for quite some time. People probably most familiar with Netflix. It was very interesting time doing that. We could talk about that more if you want. Left, did some independent consulting, got interested in the crypto world, did some investing there. Now I do some private consulting as well as a lot of research into these topics. So I'll wrap it up there, but if you want to dig into anything, let me know.
Yeah, we'll go into it more as we come. So the way we found you, for those already familiar with Bevry, is we've been covering, I found actually your Twitter because I was searching for the definition of mimetic parasitism. And you had it covered because we've been covering things like that on our channel. So you defined it as a mimetic structure whose inhabitation of an individual mind subjugates the infected mind's long-term potential to the emergent meme's short-term desires. Contrast with mimetic symbiosis or autocatalysis. And this is, it's interesting because say with Peterson became famous not only because the culture was kind of thirsting for that type of content, but because he also was able to label things articulately. And that's something that is very challenging. Like even for myself, I'm quite conceptually adept, but when it comes to articulation, people like John are superior than me in that regards. I think things like that are really needed today. And we can see that actually from all your Twitter. Like I was really drawn from to your Twitter account because you actually do talk about things that are very sophisticated, but you get good engagement. And your tweets are really nice. And it's amazing how you were able to use Twitter that way. And then we found as well your Medium article. Nick's a huge fan, and we'll talk about that earlier. And then as well for your YouTube channel, which John had even watched a few times, and we see Peterson, who we've covered all his lecture series from. John, did you want to go into anything there for your takeaways? Or...
I just really appreciate the sort of high level of discussion that you're able to bring within your YouTube channel. Like I see sometimes like one of the traits I highly appreciated about Jordan Peterson while he was doing his conversations, and lucky you for getting in quickly before he sort of stopped doing those and now hasn't really been on the scene much. But the fact that he was able to really articulate himself at this level of whoever he was sort of interacting with, he's able to communicate to them at whatever level they were able to go at. And what I really appreciated with yours is your conversation with him was probably one of the highest level IQ sort of big brain conversations that was done with him, because like you got him sort of discussing Jung. Like there's a point where he sort of brings up Jung's ideas about the pleroma, where all of the collective unconscious entities exist within it. This is pretty fascinating stuff, and I really appreciate like how you're able to get into that, and as well your other conversations with Jordan Hall and quite a few of the other sort of very deep discussions that you're bringing forward on your YouTube channel that a lot of people should, everybody watching this should definitely go check them out and try to really understand what he's getting at there.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It makes me feel much more acutely the need to re-engage with the YouTube channel. I've been wanting to bring that voice back. For some time, I felt as if I needed to. I was grasping in that space. There were many of these abstractions that I was trying to understand and trying to not just put words to, but also to try to map to more fundamental or axiomatic structures in terms of formalisms. So I spent a lot of time over the past year and a half, instead of doing a lot of the writing and the videos that I put a lot of energy into in 2017 and 2018, really going back to the well to try to deepen my knowledge in those frameworks. But I think it's definitely time to try to re-articulate or to sort of deepen a lot of those ideas that I was exploring then, and pair them with a lot of trajectories of human research and knowledge that I guess are sort of the formal language, or have thus far been the sort of most respected or formal language of knowledge itself, which would be something like mathematics. Not that that necessarily should be the case, but elegant mathematical theorems that are testable or provable are certainly one way for people who are not inside the academe to potentially break in or to make a mark across time. And so, I mean, that's something that I've been really interested in lately. But thank you for your feedback. That was one of my favorite conversations. It was really, that conversation with Peterson was quite amazing. The plural elements were pretty interesting as well. I mean, this is, maybe we're digressing, but it's kind of fascinating. I would one thing I really wish would, I really wish an alternate timeline that Jordan Peterson were able to sort of engage with, man, I'm totally blanking at the moment. Time Wave Zero, what's his name? Somebody remind me. My brain is, at the end of the day, it's a little bit, anyhow. We'll just skip over that. I'm sure I'll come back to it. But in any case, yeah, that was a really interesting conversation. But this idea, McKenna, there we go. Yeah. McKenna had this idea, there we go. I'm just like, my brain is totally falling apart right now. But yeah, McKenna had this idea of Time Wave Zero, right, where he was trying to project, and he was certainly more out there in some respects, but he had this interesting idea that, in terms of understanding these sort of the fractal inertia of the system, and was trying to understand what this endpoint to it might be. But if you then look at it as perhaps some sort of inertial projection as opposed to a final point, it actually then starts mapping to this idea of Jung's sort of plurimal projection that we then try to engage with as we go along and generate these images and these imagistic representations of that which is incorporating, the new information that we're generating as we go, but also these much more timeless patterns and their sort of co-interaction and the emergence of something that's beyond us for now, but that we constantly try to grasp into.
Okay, so this is just me trying to like grasp my memory of it. Is the time wave zero similar to like what's sometimes talked about within the artificial intelligence scene of the singularity, where there's this sort of point of where you create a system that is so capable and powerful enough and intelligent enough that any other species or intelligence systems that are out there is just incomparable to it, and it becomes sort of the culmination of all life, basically, is this sort of artificial intelligence that becomes to this sort of point of what you might call a biological or technological god. Is that similar to McKenna's time point zero or time wave zero?
From his perspective, and like we have to be sort of, I guess, careful discussing it, because what I'm not saying is that I think that he was, sort of correct in his models, and that this is a scientific theory that should be something that we model our epistemic foundations of society upon in any way. But it is a fascinating idea in the sense that he wanted to try to understand, because this was when, fractal mathematics and chaos theory was just coming on the scene, and he was attempting to use some of these mathematical tools to, he paired it with certain elements of binary arithmetic in the I Ching, and then he thought he found that a convergence point, something like, I forget the year, but some fixed point of, a fixed amount of time out in the future, and he saw that as a kind of a singularity past which we were unable to understand the dynamics of sort of space, time, and consciousness, and that something would happen. And obviously there's certain millenarian undertones there, and we don't, we can talk about it as interesting without talking about it as necessarily true, right? And that's the way that I sort of, and in the same way that when we were talking about the Jungian elements of sort of archetypal representation, we can talk about these ways we use language to grasp at patterns that we do not yet have any formal specifications for, right? So I don't know. I think we have a lot of things to talk about, and I don't want to take us way too far off the rails here, but that was a fascinating conversation, and yeah, there's a lot to explore there.
Yeah.
Cool. Alrighty, so for the viewer, what we'll be doing is we'll be going through trying to understand how Matt kind of became this wise, so we can try and learn how to emulate that, and then we'll be going over a general discussion towards the end. So the last half will be a more general discussion. So like for Matt, you gave us this overview, right? Where it seems as if you started off with like this interest in, what would you call it? Like the social systems first, and then that got you into software, which is very different from probably most people, especially like, as a software developer myself, most people in software, they learned the hard way that they needed to care about people. And it wasn't that intuitive to them. But then they also have a lot of issues where they view everything as systems. So there is like a natural branch in there. But what were the things that got you interested in that? Because you come across really wise. Like, is this just like a Californian privilege of like middle-class upbringing that gave you like this ability to, good schooling, things like that? Or was it things that happened in your life experiences that really crafted these interests?
Yeah, so just in brief, I suppose there are definitely elements of my upbringing that are quite relevant, and that as I've grown older and as I've attempted to reflect upon my developmental trajectory, have become increasingly relevant. Or I would say that I'm increasingly aware that they were quite formative elements of my psyche in ways that I didn't realize until I had some space to reflect back upon them. And I think one of those, well, I guess there are a couple, but the first one is that as I was growing up, I bounced around quite a bit around the United States. So I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, but I lived in DC and Maryland and St. Louis before I was 5. And then my parents were in different parts of the country, and I bounced back and forth between them multiple times, and then went up to New England for college, and then back to California, for college. And then after that, I was in Boston for, another 4.5 years, and then went to California. And so, one of the things you recognize, or one of the things that I realized at a very early age, because these were not just different places, these were also very different cultures and very different spaces. One of the things that I took away from that, or I think I began to pick up, is that, there's not a singular reality, and there's not a singular, and there might, you can look at the world such that you try to impose a singular objective frame of reference. But if you actually spend time within the subjective spaces and the emergent cultures of different locations, the assumptions and the histories of those places dramatically drive and parameterize the day-to-day experiences and realities of the people in those spaces. And it's not easy to understand that without traveling between those kind of spaces. And this is one of the reasons why people advocate for travel, right? Obviously, but I think it's even more fundamentally understood when it's part of one's youth, when it's part of one's day-to-day experience, having to move into new social contexts, try to understand new assumptions, try to understand what are the values, what's the value system here that I'm entering, what is the grammar here, what, people spoke differently. This was also before the internet, so it's like literally there's different slang, there's different languages, there were different values, and that was just, it became very salient to me that there were these different ways of understanding, these different ways of being, these different phenomenological lenses into reality, and that, to be able to, and you could apply that not just regionally, but also if you look at each person as a microcosmic reality, the same thing happens at a fractal scale, where each person to person is trying to navigate that in interpersonal space all the time as well. So, I think the more I've reflected upon my childhood, the more that gave me a sort of natural intuitive sense, or natural intuitive understanding, that then later led me to try to more formally unpack that, and to try to more formally map certain understandings of cognitive sciences, or economic research, or philosophical writings throughout history upon that personal experience. So that was one thing. And then another thing that I think was very important, if not desirable necessarily, was a lot of exposure early to some pretty sort of statistically significant statistically significant deviations from normalcy in terms of exposure early in life to sort of suffering and death. And so, we can or can't go further into that, but, depending on, I have this essay that I haven't fully written, but it's called A Coffin Too Small for God. At least this is the working title. And, this was an essay that I started writing to try to understand the impact of watching, a sister of mine who died very early be buried in an extremely tiny coffin by, a community that was religious and held many of these particular ideas about what was happening and what would happen after that, and what the purpose of all this was. And I was in 5th grade. And so, that opened up a whole can of worms for me as well. And that took me down some pretty difficult paths. There were dark times. I questioned a lot of these sort of a lot of the social axioms, a lot of the sources of meaning that many people take for granted, and that was a pretty chaotic ride. But I think on the other side of it, it was quite formative, and I learned a lot from it. So I think those two things, more than anything else, sort of form the foundations of why I cared later about the things that I did.
Right. So this is fascinating because so on 2 points that I'll raise. So the first one is, like, say for myself, I grew up with exchange students. They would live in my home to learn English, and they would stay on 3 months to 1 year terms. And that gave me the very same insight, which is Australian culture that I was embedded in is only one way of looking at the world. And that constantly having to teach them English or explain all the idioms that we would use in everyday language and integrate with the different value systems always showed me, hey, there's ways to opt out of this reality that my peers are taking for granted. But then on the other side, Jordan Peterson, he has mentioned as well that entrepreneurs generally have higher amounts of childhood trauma. And that seems to drive them to then a necessity to try and prevent trauma later. And yeah, so a lot of entrepreneurs have divorced parents. So this is really interesting. But then, you know, there's a difference between myself and you that I would see, which is you went this academia route where, like, is your ability, so you have this environment that offers you this perspective of how to go about, you know, that you can opt out, that social systems can be studied, or that they're distinct from each other. Then you had the kind of this necessity to kind of challenge that in your life. But then what drove you to go like this way of research and testing? Because I only learned that when I was like 27 or something like that, that hey, I have this mind, I should learn how to use it, and I should engage in philosophy and engage in these things. Like I learned that way too late. So like what was the guidance or the experiences that drove you that route?
Yeah, I mean, I think that also goes back to Catholic school education,
Right.
or sort of these religious education classes in which I was always the kid asking the wrong questions. And by wrong questions usually means the right questions, but they are the ones that end up getting you placed into the hallway typically. If people are, and this is the interesting thing about education, and this is a slight tangent, but I think the interesting thing about the educational structure and its formal sense these days is that, when you have a one-to-many type relationship and you've severed when you sever the sort of umbilical connection between parents and children in the educational context, you end up oftentimes optimizing for the efficiency of the teacher. And so when you end up optimizing for something like the efficiency of someone trying to communicate the message, they don't necessarily respond that well to people who are asking questions that they may not be prepared to answer. And so, I engaged with this from a very early age and felt the side effects of this from a very early age. But it always seemed to be the case that whenever I asked these questions, that was actually an indicator that there was a very deep well of knowledge lying beneath that initial sort of frustration or rejection that somebody was not necessarily willing to, walk down with me, but that if I was willing to walk down it myself, however I could, that I would get something back, and that would be meaningful, and that would help me sort of piece together the answers that I was looking for. And as you were talking about trauma, that is one of the reasons why I've reflected upon that, the meaning of that in my life, because to some extent there was definitely a large sort of arc of my life where I felt as if, to the extent one could know the world, one could anticipate the sort of transformations in one's context, and therefore shield oneself and those one cares about from unnecessary suffering. And so, and I still think to a large extent there is a great deal of truth in that, but there's also a lot more than just knowledge that you need to be able to effectively do that. And to some extent, you can't necessarily ever do that in total, right? There's always going to be some ineradicable amount of suffering in this world at a quite fundamental emergent level. But yeah, so for me, I think there's always this drive to continuously find any information that I could and read it and study it. I mean, that's another thing, reading from a very early age. I spent a lot of time alone and with books in these imaginary worlds, as well as in worlds that were informing me about things that I didn't yet know, but that were quite interesting to me. And so spending time constantly searching and trying to understand and develop this mental model of the world was something that was quite important to me. At first unconsciously, and then later more consciously. And then that, I think that took me through the academy. But I didn't stay with that for very long, because I did, and this was in 2000, I was in college at Yale from 2004 to 2008 as an undergraduate. And I was doing these research projects and I was working in these groups, but I also had a very, there was still this element where there were certain questions that were unaskable, or that weren't the right questions, or that if the head of that department wasn't interested in the question, you wouldn't be able to study that question, right? Not that it necessarily should be that way, but oftentimes this is how these institutions operate. And so for me, simultaneously, there was this world of software emerging, and it was a much more sort of Wild West type of environment. And there was a lot of opportunity there. And I had learned to code while I was studying emergent evolutionary systems, because I was doing agent-based modeling. I was trying to model evolutionary context and how different types of agents emerged into, via their preferences and their types of interaction, emerged into certain larger scale patterns of behavior. And so, I left the academy for that, and I haven't ever gone back. There have been times when I've potentially wanted to, or thought it might be interesting, but increasingly with the state of the academy and the sort of suffocating intellectual climate that appears to be pervading most of those institutions, I'm happier to be here conversing with you all than there. So, yeah.
Right. It's fascinating because one of the questions we have, which is, well, what is your method for approaching life and exploring the unknown? So what discipline do you use to approach problems, obtain goals, and pursue interests? Because it seems from here, right, it's like most people, and we did a previous live stream on this a few weeks ago, like people don't when they face cognitive dissonance, the first impulse is like do the minimum necessary to go back into homeostasis, like go back to the identity they were before. Well, like always questioning things or pushing the boundaries and like seeing that, like for pretty much most people, even for most of my life, like would be like, okay, you pushed this far, now it's time to retreat. You're offending the other person. Why continue? Or even like, how can I minimize the harm because I'm doing these things that's ticking people off. I don't want to hurt them. I care about them. But then it seems like for you, you're a very driven person. You seem to kind of can see a few steps ahead. You can go that switch from Yale to then software to then business to now this more collaborative wisdom space. Were these easy decisions to make? Like, what was the pushing factors for this that allowed you to traverse these life changes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and I can't necessarily pretend that I even know myself that well to give a great answer, but I'll try to give a decent answer. And I guess I would say that there are a few elements. I think just in terms of personality, psychological disposition, I also tend to be very high in the disagreeability scale. And so that extends, I think most people typically think about disagreeability or disagreeableness as an interpersonal trait, but the idea of thought in one's own head is also subject to one's own psychological tendencies. And so I have an extremely deep disagreeable streak that also is not just, felt outwardly, but also dramatically impacts the conversations I have with myself in my own mind about my own priorities and my own capacity to spend time in line with my values. And that is not to say that I succeed even most of the time, right? I mean, it is really challenging. I mean, you can't be a slave driver to yourself, right? But you can, in some ways, increasingly find ways of negotiating with yourself such that it's possible to incrementally spend your time in ways that are increasingly in line with your longer term goals, as opposed to some of these shorter term aspects of sort of the unconscious elements of one's psyche that would have their way with you if they could and never give anything back, I guess. And so, for me, it's kind of like there's an element of this curiosity that we discussed earlier, the desire to understand the landscape and the knowledge and where things are going and where things are headed. What are the trends on the horizon? Mixed with what I care about, which is deeply, like, if I'm going to be most abstract about it, what serves life, what actually serves the continuation of life itself. And I think, that might sound very abstract or almost completely removed from day-to-day life, but I don't think it is. I think it is something that we should all concern ourselves with in terms of the capacity to understand how our behaviors actually ladder up into a world that is either self-sustaining or self-terminating, because that is actually a very meaningful question in our lifetime. And it's a fascinating time to be alive for that reason. And so that's another question that has driven me from one space to another, is the space of understanding, maybe it's actually best for me to go and tell you about what actually got me interested. Halfway through college, I switched my majors into this evolutionary psychology space because of a single book. And it's not even that book was the best book in the world. It was more of the fact that it posed a very interesting question. So the book was called Radical Evolution. I think it's called Radical Evolution: The Promises and Perils of Changing Our Minds, Bodies, and What It Means to Be Human, or something like that. It was by Joel Garreau. really interesting cover art of Eve in the Garden of Eden picking the apple off the tree. And this book, I read this book, and the whole question was, okay, given the trajectory of our development as a species, it seems as if we're approaching an inflection point. And at this inflection point, it seems as if things can, this potential singularity, things can evolve such that beyond it, we wouldn't even recognize reality, such that, because it's such a paradise, because it's such, the other direction, because it may become so hellish or non-existent that we don't, we can't even recognize it because we're not around, or that there might be some middle path that that sort of, we muddle through and things don't change quite as much as we would have thought. And I think this was just a fascinating question to me. It's like, what are the elements of our human capacity, our human technological development, that are changing the possibility space around this inflection point? And what are we doing as individuals and as communities and as societies to tip the scale in one way or another? Because I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. And that was an animating question, for me, and it still is. And that is sort of what has guided me from one space to another, I think. Yeah, at the highest level.
Right. So it seems then, like, even using your own terminology, like what's animating you, it seems to be you're always wanting to be on the frontier, and that's quite rare. And it's kind of what drove you to, like, because again, most people, they just want to be an employee, and even disagreeable people, a lot of times disagreeable people will find it hard to find outlets for that curiosity. So it seems like mentorship has played some role. Is that mentorship primarily from books? Like that book was a example of that. Was it met physical people in your life, or was it mostly from books? Like, what were the things that connected that curiosity then to opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a few people in person, though, to be completely honest, I think, interestingly enough, most of it has been more virtually, in the sense either of sort of historical figures, or the content available from people, people like Jordan Peterson, for example. I mean, that was a really fascinating, it was I'm certainly not unique in saying that engaging with his content was a kind of, it resonated with elements of my psyche that were there but weren't fully online, I would say, in the sense that, well, I don't know, with him, for example, because I was studying his stuff before he became, before the whole trans activist, brouhaha that threw him into the spotlight, because I was already on the path of trying to understand what the sort of mythopoetic domain has to do with the encoding of our game theoretic evolution. What is, how do you map something like, for example, the idea of forgiveness onto optimal solutions for tit for tat equilibria, right? Like, there are these things that seem to align, and I was trying to dig into them. And then I came across this guy, and it was fascinating because it was like, well, here's a career's worth of knowledge and wisdom compressed into an extremely dense and digestible format, so that I am capable of accelerating my knowledge or wisdom in this direction. And so, people like that, and one of the wonderful aspects about the internet is the fact that we're able to find those types of sources of sort of compressed wisdom and knowledge, and even sort of, role models, right? And it's obviously a strange and sort of controversial topic to discuss, an internet personality as a role model. It's hard to understand what that actually means in this day and age, right? But yeah, I mean, it does seem to be the case that for quite some time, most of the people, at least in my personal environment, didn't necessarily seem to, it wasn't clear to them that they knew why they were doing what they were doing, right? Inertia was the primary driver of the vast majority of lives I saw in my daily existence, whether that was in the startup reality or whether that was in the academic reality. It wasn't necessarily domain specific. It was more, I don't know, I felt like perhaps it was some sort of malaise. It was the Fukuyama end of history period, right? In the sense where where, yeah, we've got it all down. We understand how everything works. And, there are just some I's to be dotted and T's to be crossed, and we'll play this out. And I think in some ways that was the animating psychology of the boomer generation. And we're obviously realizing that this is no longer the case, and that we are still, history is in play, and we need to figure this out. And that's why, people are emerging to the fore. I mean, obviously, I guess we have somebody here is also one of the portal moderators, right? And like, that is a fascinating space as well. I've been sort of keeping a finger on the pulse of the portal, and Eric Weinstein is a really interesting figure in terms of sort of a role model for those who don't typically take on role models, I guess, right? The sort of like anti-establishment types who don't necessarily want to subject themselves to many years of sort of psychological or economic abuse to be able to get the credentials to live a successful or meaningful life. And he's an interesting figure because, unlike Jordan Peterson, he kind of pulled the ripcord on academia, even though he had his PhD and was a brilliant mind, and went his own direction, and in many ways shows that, along so many different dimensions, whether it's academic or whether it's interpersonal as interviews, or whether it's the fact that he's able to simultaneously hold some views that would be considered by people who think in like a one-dimensional political spectrum as quite on the left, but yet work and be friends completely with someone like Peter Thiel. These are really fascinating people. These are sort of the, I don't know, they're sort of these intellectual and ethical attractors. And, myself, amongst many other people, we're beginning to orbit, right? And that's taking us, it's interesting to see. I can't tell you what's going to come out of that, but it's certainly more interesting than what we had before, in terms of much more strict and rigid hierarchical patterns of attempting to generate knowledge and transmit it across generations.
Yeah, this is at first I wasn't particularly satisfied with your answer, because I felt you skirted around the connecting this curiosity with opportunity. But then I thought about it a bit more, and actually I realized what we're actually doing at Bevry is actually what you're talking about. It is this connecting opportunity factor. So if you go to bevry.me, which anyone can do, it goes to the Bevry Manifesto, and we have this bit here where we say there's this new market that's happening, and we talk about the reasons why. That's transforming from isolated wisdom eventually to conversational competitive wisdom, but then eventually it's collaborative wisdom, and that's what Bevry's about. It's representative of this conversation, what's happening on Portal, what's happening, what Peterson is also kind of about as well, in this way of, and it seems the opportunity here is this way of connecting this curiosity or this isolation of struggle to then people wiser who can guide, or not even to exactly people, but just pure ideas that can serve as guidance and a better compass. And that's what we've been doing at Bevry through conversations for multiple years. And now we're launching products and projects to help with that. So viewers interested, they can check it out all in the description. So the next question will then be, what do you consider like the current frontier for yourself? Then, like, where are you at now? What's the things you're wrestling with? What's the problems you're solving? Where are you at?
Sure. So, I mean, there's a couple different fronts. So there's a project that I've been working on for a little while now, which is trying to basically allow people to specify their values, the things that matter for them, the kind of transcendent values like family or health or intellectual development, and specify those values, and then try to understand how to work backwards from those into weaving together patterns of life that allow you to really bridge that sort of divide between short-term desires or short-term tendencies, and actually and the tendency of those short-term, like if you were to give in to all these short-term temptations, the likelihood that you would ever, that when you're on your deathbed, you would look back on your deathbed and then say, actually, my life was a reflection of those highest values that I held, right? But we have to bridge that gap somehow. And how do you actually do that? And how do you how do you use a lot of the tools and the knowledge that we've developed and quite frankly abused in terms of most of our social media context and many of the companies that use this information to extract people's attention and to parasitize people's behavior. How do you actually use those to allow people to shape their own lives and connect them with their own values? So I'm working on something for that. And, first of all, it starts with people, doing it for themselves, but obviously there's a huge part that needs to allow for the connectivity and the emergence of that into larger communities. And I think that it's not something that is unique to me. I think many people are trying to develop platforms along these lines. I think we even have another person on this call who's creating something similar. So part of this is also just how do we actually, I would like I'll put a pin in that and say I would like to find a way to work collaboratively with others so that we're not necessarily inefficiently using all of our energy and sort of trying to build separate grammars that are not able to speak to one another in terms of these similar goals, right? Because I think that's a huge part that leads me sort of to the next frontier, which is how do we develop better languages, better grammars to allow people who are fundamentally saying the same thing to actually understand that what they are saying is related, or that there is an actual identity relationship there, because so much of the conflict that emerges from our online discourse especially flows from the fact that when you remove many of these evolved mechanisms that we have for understanding one another, whether it's different types of facial recognition patterns, understanding facial expressions, whether it's intonations of voice, whether it's word choice, or whether it's our ability to just look someone in the eyes, right? All of these things, as you strip one by one away, and all you're left with is the sort of lower resolution encoding of what you're trying to say, it's very easy to forget or to not know at all that you are on the same page with someone else, and that there's just a sort of default level of conflict therefore built into these kinds of platforms. And so what does it mean to be able to communicate such that we actually generate emergent wisdom and artifacts of that wisdom as a byproduct of our communication? I think that's another frontier that's really important right now. We see Twitter. I mean, what is the byproduct of Twitter besides profits for some people and rage and destabilization for our society? I mean, we do have the ability, there are positive externalities for some of us. That being said, I think we all acknowledge that it's playing quite a destabilizing role in our society at the moment. It is wagging the tail of our consciousness in ways that might not be sustainable. So what does it mean to have conversation that doesn't just allow us to communicate, but that also has byproducts that amplify or catalyze a positive direction? I think that's a really interesting question. And then just in the most abstract realm of what I'm working on, there's a model that I've been really interested in terms of the easiest way to describe it is the topology of consciousness. So what does it actually mean to understand consciousness as a topological structure and the evolution of consciousness as a topological sort of transformation across time? And so we could get into that or not, but that's I don't want to start using too many just weird abstract words to discuss that, but that's something that I spend some time on in terms of my more sort of pure mathematical research.
Maybe that would be a great time for me to step in if I could, then.
Sure. Yeah, because we've got one more question left, and then we'll open up to.
But it's more jazzy this way, don't you think?
All right, go for the jazz.
All right, great. I'm never really quite sure how to be formal in these kinds of situations or what's required of these get-ups. And welcome to this space. I appreciate what you've been doing. I appreciate it because I too have been engaged in the same struggle to understand and build and appreciate what this crazy mess of a world is. And I think we are, for the first time, in a place where we can do like a full cybernetic analysis of the inputs and outputs for every human being. And we can personally have access to that kind of data and allow it to structure the way that we integrate into the communities that we're in. And I think that our level of understanding is getting to a point where we can really allow an emergent structure to unfold that does represent a new kind of more stable civilization. I'm very confident that that is a direction we can head in. And I see some element of that in what you're discussing and what you've discussed with others online. and I'm really appreciative of that. And yeah, if we could find a way to collaborate, that would be awesome. You have the maybe the dubious honor of having the only tweet I've ever tweeted out. Um, yeah. So this is hilarious, actually. So I found Peterson before he got Bill C16 famous too. I found some Reddit posts that linked to him, and yeah, I found his synopsis of Western historical and philosophical thought fascinating. And then it was such a bonus to watch him rise through that and provide such a fascinating cultural touchstone for so many people that also happened to be strangely personally familiar to me, because I was going through the kind of dark depression of a divorce and autoimmune disease and trying to be a father, and all of that was kind of mixed up in this crazy mess. And he was there as a part of that. It's a wonderful thing to behold. Actually, a lot of people stand up and a little taller after that whole phenomenon. So anyhow, yeah, I think that there's a really interesting point that we have now where we can utilize technology in a very intentional way to understand ourselves finally and fully, maybe, right, as best we can, and how we can come together in a really fascinating and more novel way. And that was McKenna's, I think, ultimate singularity was hyper novelty. It was where novelty would be so radically abundant that you could keep track of anything. I think that's his notion of what we're being drawn towards. And that's interesting. But that right there is, and yes, I would love to go into that second point about consciousnness, because I myself on the Eric Weinstein portal tried to get them involved in trying to understand what it would be to model the topological structure of the fine structure of conscious states in the human mind and how that arises. I don't know if you're familiar with Penrose and Hameroff and probably Bondi's work, but yeah, it's fascinating stuff. And maybe we don't have to get into it on the podcast, but yeah.
I mean, we can or we cannot. I mean, I would love to discuss this at some point.
Sure.
Yeah,
I'm always looking for people who share some of that interest and context to to deepen that conversation and to hopefully also produce artifacts of it, right? To produce some sort of model that might actually be testable, that might actually be programmable fundamentally, right? I'm very fascinated by what it means to create sort of, I've been, like I said earlier, I've been very interested by agent-based systems for quite some time. So I think that's a really interesting test ground for these hypotheses. I mean, I think going back to just briefly touching on this idea of that sort of hyper novelty, there's an interesting question with respect to what is the distinction between hyper novelty and chaos as a sort of mythological construct or actually a mathematical construct. I mean, I think another really interesting thinker along those lines is Stuart Kauffman. I don't know if you've read a lot of his work. But Stuart Kauffman is a fascinating theoretical biologist and brilliant mind. He's done some work on sort of physics as well. But he proposed, he has this idea of a complexity catastrophe, where in some of his models, he showed that on adaptive landscapes, if you actually have too many causal impositions, from one node in the network upon another. So if on this call, like the idea of it on this call would be something along the lines of, if I say something, as soon as I say something, if two other people on this call speak immediately, and then if they speak, two other people on the call immediately speak, before you note it, the entire call is going to be just a cacophony of voice, right? And therefore, what that does is dramatically reduce the ability of evolution to actually gain any traction on that landscape. So, I mean, that's like novelty is an interesting concept in and of itself to discuss in the evolutionary context. But yeah.
Chaos as the ground of being, right?
Conversation sometime.
I think of all the mythopoetic structures and stories that where creation comes from that, right? There's something there for sure. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, well, we could probably have many discussions about how to follow this up, because again, it seems like it's all our life's work to challenge at least some of those frontiers. The topological consciousness, that's out of my domain of expertise. I'm more software entrepreneurial focused, but yeah, in terms of the what Tyler also touched upon, yeah, we're doing Bevry's mission is to spread the collaborative wisdom market and expand it. And that's through discussions like this, as well as through projects. And one of those projects is Fountain, which is essentially going to bring, like, it's stupid that the NSA has all that access that Tyler talked about, but the public doesn't. Like, it's so weird. And so one of our projects that we're working on is Fountain. So Fountain scales conversations to massively collaborative wisdom through cross-pollination, interactive transcripts, and topical curation and creative funding. We're breaking it down into 2 MVPs, Bevry study and Bevry conversations. So things like this thing, people should be able to add timestamp comments that are actually owned by the public, not YouTube, and actually be able to interact and vote things up, and then schedule discussions about books, schedule discussions about this discussion, and then bump these ideas up in a collaborative way. So that's really what we're working on, especially for Peterson stuff. Like, we gained so much benefit from arranging study group sessions for each of his lectures. We went through them all, and we got so much value from that, participating in that. And that participation should be easy access to everyone. Everyone should be able to collaboratively participate in that, rather than just being constrained to the consumption devices of an iPad or an iPhone or an Android phone. Like, these are consumption devices, not production. They're not. It's to overcome that dichotomy from consumer to producer is a real challenge, and I see it as like a struggle in the children today. It's so, like, even back before, like with computing, like if we wanted to do anything, we had to take apart the computer. We had to go into MS-DOS, type things. We actually had to understand how the computer worked, to interact with it. But like an iPhone, it's just like no one needs to know how it works, and it kind of robs them from the experience of interaction with the device. Like, same thing for cars. For mechanics generally have a necessity to know how it works, but then as we move to Tesla and electric vehicles, we're also somewhat being robbed of how these things work. And to some extent, we need to find ways to bridge that. And one of the focuses, at least for myself, is how to scale this organizational effort from a different way. And it seems I have a lot of thoughts on that. They're going to be progressing. I've shared them with John already, and he's on board with them. But that would be like a series of conversations that I think would be fantastic, that we could keep going on. But before we get one more thing, before we get into the general discussion, then is for these frontiers, right? Like, what's, like, if people want to follow up with you for these things, then what's like the strengths you're bringing to it, and what are the weaknesses? Like, how do you think we can scale these frontiers? And what are you bringing to scale them, and what are the things you need help in scaling them?
Sure. I mean, I think I'll start, I guess, with strengths. Seeing connectivity and seeing patterns is a strength of mine. Being able to connect information from disparate domains and synthesize it into something that can potentially then be encoded in some sort of pragmatic function, right? I think that's what I really love to do, is try to understand what is the common denominator amidst a sea of things that seem at a surface level unrelated, but have some sort of commonality, right? So that sort of pattern detection and articulation is something that I think I have a strength that is perhaps, yeah, I think that's a strength. And then
could I pause on that
obviously
for a moment? Would you let me double click on that?
Of course.
Yeah. Would you say that maybe that also demonstrates as a kind of shamanic skill too? Do you ever find yourself trying to construct mythopoetic ways of seeing the world? Does that come naturally at all to you?
So, I mean, I I wouldn't necessarily claim that as a strength, but I've written quite a bit of poetry. I don't usually share a lot of it, but the reason I write poetry is not because I find it necessarily beautiful, but because it is a medium in which you can use language most abstractly or loosely in a way that can sort of, I don't know, like a beautiful poem, the words don't necessarily connect in the way that, like, if you were to try to dissect a poem with a dictionary, you're going to have a very difficult time, because the vast majority of the meaning in the poem is held in the contextual noosphere, so to speak, right? And not just within the noosphere, but oftentimes at the very edge of it, that's trying to make sense of the space in which the sort of the pure chaos is touching the very edges of the least well-formed order that we're attempting to make of the world. And so yes, I think that's definitely.
That's so well described right there. Yeah, because that's how, when you're constructing it too, that's kind of what it feels like, right? Like it almost feels like, for me, like there's like iron filings in my brain somewhere, and I'm trying to hold a magnet over them, and some of them are yanking up and pulling into this kind of gravitational well of meaning that I'm searching for. And it really is like at the edges of that sensibility. It's all wrapped up in cultural icons and cultural sensibilities, and the pacing and tonality that's deeply integrated within like the perspectival speaking of the words, all that stuff. Yeah. Sorry.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, that was one of the most beautiful elements. Like I don't know if I had ever heard anybody describe. Well, I guess I'll start at a different place. Quite often in the context of discussion between different spaces, different social spaces or different economic spaces, whether you're talking about, like, let's say that we have a scientist speaking to an artist, or a sociologist even speaking to a biologist, right? We tend to think of these like, we tend to like, I don't know if you've ever seen, I think it's an XKCD comic where it's like this line of like how, I guess, what is it, like how rigorous or how abstract some sort of scientist is, and then it goes from something like, they linearize it such that it goes from something like a social anthropologist all the way down to a physicist, and then another double that distance, there's a mathematician and say, hey, yeah, it's like I'm over here, right? But even that linearity, right, I think it's the wrong model in a sense, where it's like we are all attempting to digest and grammaticalize or create sort of semiotic structures that make interpretable or comprehensible parts of reality at different layers of this emergent structure. And then we need to be able to hand them off across those layers, both vertically and horizontally, right? And so it's very strange where I see all of this contention in terms of people attempting to sort of jockey for position, with respect to what is more or less real, when in reality it's this constant evolutionary process of trying to digest pure novelty, because every time we create something new in the world, there's a reaction to that, and it enables an entire new possibility space of things that are just completely unknown. And it's not going to be the people who are the most hyper-rational thinkers who are going to be able to initially shape that complete chaos into something with the outlines of a form. It's going to be the poets or the artists, right? And then that needs to be handed off as an image to the society that can then potentially inspire some idea, perhaps even in something like, a dream of like the hexane molecule being a snake eating its tail, right? Without somebody creating the image of the snake, eating its tail, the dream would never have come to the mind of I forget the guy's name, but who basically discovered, the hexane molecule, because it came to him in a dream. Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, it's this massively dynamic feedback process, but no one's taught that. And so from a very early age, we are not sort of programmed with the grammar to be able to see other people as playing those sorts of roles in this collaborative, adaptive process. And it's so important to be able to have those conversations and see the world that way, because we've reached a point at which if we don't see the world that way, it seems, at least to me, almost guaranteed that a descent into chaos is in our future. So, yeah.
Are you familiar with Ian McGilchrist's work, like the Master and His Emissary?
Yeah.
It seems very much to me like the over mechanization or the over reliance upon left hemispherical modeling and scientific reductionism in our time. There's kind of a lag, and I don't want to blame it. I mean, those tools are incredibly powerful, and I don't think we should ever have dispensed with them. But we could say that the collective right hemisphere has lagged behind in its capacity to summon the mythopoetic structures that offer an explanatory bedrock for the values that should be informing those scientific structures. And that's kind of the lag, I think, that was somewhat filled by Peterson's stance, right? And that was partially what we're doing here, and that maybe is incumbent upon us as the middle ground between the boomers and the younger generations to find a way to give mythopoetic structure to really what's at the edge of our cultural disintegration right now, right? It seems to me like a pivotal aspect. Yeah.
I mean, exactly. Definitely. And just to sort of dig even further into that, I mean, it seems like the emergent disintegration that we're seeing at the highest levels of society, they're reflective of the disintegration of the capacity to sort of work with both the sort of right brain, left brain elements of sort of divergent and convergent, models of reality within our own minds and within our own interpersonal relationships and within the way that we make sense out of the world. And yet, and the crazy thing about this is, like, it seems as if to some extent this is an imprint upon the individual of the historical, if we're going to use the brain model, almost like a dissection of the corpus callosum between the sort of mythopoetic imagery of religion and the Enlightenment rationality models of epistemic understanding and comprehension. And this is, we had this sort of, we dissected that which could have potentially kept them in dialogue. And it's fairly unfortunate. I mean, and depending on who you ask, they might cast aspersions or blame in either direction. I mean, it's. I mean, personally, I think it's unfortunate that the church made the moves that it made in terms of, it had people within its own ranks who were creating the seeds of the poetic domain, that these seeds of rational, concrete, very pragmatic sort of epistemic structures were emerging. They were precipitating out of that space, but they were, because they were, because of the fact that a heretic is actually worse than any enemy, they were sort of rejected by the mimetic immune system of that entity, and that created the schism that is now, perpetuated itself across thousands of years and is imprinted in every single one of our minds, whether we understand it or not, and is potentially the thing that is inhibiting us from reintegrating those modes of making sense in the world. And so it's just like, it's an interesting question how we can come to, stitch that back together across these different scales.
Yeah. A superseding, overarching narrative that binds it all back together. One ring to rule them all.
The meta narrative.
Yeah.
The God of gods.
The God of gods.
Cool. So it seems like it would be most proficient of us to, because I'll share the agenda of what's left. So we've got these before we do jump in the general, there will be a thing, but I want to go.
By the way, I never got to my weaknesses, and one of them is staying on schedules.
So that. Okay, right. Yeah, because I want to. I'll touch on this once we cover over this, because.
Right.
But it is true though, right? Like there's this playful creative space, right? Which is, and it's like Basecamp talk about it. It's a lot with software engineering. Like there's some people, and they want to, at least for me, I always want to make sure I've got the foundations right? And it doesn't matter whether or not, like, because with startups or with business, a lot of it is just deliver. But then they don't care if the foundations are right. Like it's like it's kind of crazy. Like with how many startups fail, and it's just like a little bit more pre-thought, right? And a little bit more collaboration on your assumptions, your axioms going in. But at the same time, there's this balance where you also have to say, this is my projection onto reality now. I'm taking control, I'm claiming agency, and I'm bending the boundaries of the matrix now. So there's always like this dance that happens, but at the same time, it's quite challenging. So like, so I'll get onto this once I've just overviewed the topics we can dive in, so we can allocate appropriate time for this meeting. So we've got these metagame topics: mimetic parasitism. A few people here keen to get into that. The social component to value creation. Ways for the red religion to have a fighting chance against the blue church. Topological consciousness, you raised that. But then we also have all the stuff in the practical build game. So I want to so we got cryptocurrency, DeFi, data privacy, Patreon alternatives. I saw you did a video on that. We've also looked into that heavily. Then there's projects which, for those frontiers, many members here are working on things here. So what I'm thinking maybe, if you're inclined to do so, is we schedule all this build stuff for another conversation. That way we can go into detail about opportunities for collaboration. And then we save the rest of this one for this high level abstract stuff that'll be valuable to the broadest audience, because not everyone's going to be interested in the nitty gritty details of how we can build and collaborate, like the details and the semantics of that. Does that sound good?
Sounds good to me. And I just want to say explicitly that I appreciate you keeping us keeping our feet to the fire on the schedule.
Yeah, right. He's quite good at that. And I have to bow out in 5 minutes. I gotta leave at 10:30. You said dance, right. But there's an ecstatic dance tonight. It was not exactly ecstatic, but I've got to be there for a girl. So
right. I'll do the what would you call it? The formal zouk dancing, the partner dancing, and then hand it over to.
You're all invited, by the way. Yeah. We're just
right.
showing each other crazy dance moves on Zoom. So,
alrighty.
Well, yeah. So let me just say my piece and then part then, so I don't interrupt anymore. Yeah, I don't want to interrupt the flow here. So please, if we could, let's continue the conversation. I think there's really a lot of interesting things going on in a few different places here on the internet that you might be curious about. And I think there's a lot of things that are about to pull together, let's say, into some threads are about to twist, so to speak. And I think it's important. I think it's important that we do show a good vision of what's possible, I think. And that's partly demonstrated in these great conversations that everybody's having, and partly in the things that we build, like actually build, and not just, I think, even in the software, but even in the physical space, right? Mm-hmm. So again, thank you so much for all the words that you've put out into the world. I've agreed with a large portion of them, and I look forward to any work that we may be able to do together. And these guys are, in particular, let Nick speak. Don't let him get away without talking to you. Everybody here is a fascinating and wonderful person.
Cool.
So, the feeling is definitely mutual, and I look forward very much to speaking and working with you in the future.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Great. Thanks so much, Tyler. For when Tyler jumps back, just to touch on what Tyler said here, has anyone seen this, like time lapses of mold growing? I see this at the same thing where if you look into those time lapses that are on the Apple TV of like the space station flying over the Earth at nighttime, like human cities and human organization is incredibly similar to this, where it's like we converge out into these little things, and then eventually it touches on like a part of nutrients, and then boom, all the mold converges to that area of high nutrients, which is the same thing we see with the cities when we look into the lights of human civilization over nighttime. Like each city is then like a hub that then connects people again. And the internet or the internet has kind of done that for the memosphere. And it seems like right now there is so much nutrients. What is it? It's in fire burning. There's another term for it, like undergrowth, or not undergrowth, like fuel. There's so much fuel right now for something in this collaborative wisdom space, and it's just now all the different people in are just converging like the mold, and it's going to erupt. It's incredibly exciting. And then afterwards, once the collaborative wisdom space has done its thing in the next 50-year cycle, then it'll move over somewhere else. So we've got like 15 minutes of the scheduled live time. I think if we're okay to go over that a little bit, I want to give Nick a good opportunity to speak, because one of the things I think, hey, am I breaking up for anyone? Because I'm getting like echo on my thing.
Sound all right.
I hear you.
All right, I'm going to pause the local recording because I think my CPU can't handle it. Because I think let's save that for the next conversation, which is what are the issues with these frontiers? Like, what are the weaknesses in it, and how we think they can grow? We can either actually let's do it right now, because for those weaknesses, it seems right now, and we've got this in the Bevry manifesto that talks about it quite brilliantly, I think, which is that this transition from isolated wisdom where you're struggling alone and you're afraid to speak, and then eventually you go into this competitive or conversational wisdom phase, which is like you join a church or you join an ideology where other people share same things you've been curious about, but then at the same time, you've got faith in some axioms you haven't tested. You've just intuited them to be true. And then finally, there's this collaborative wisdom space where it's just like, hey, let's continuously rebirth, or as one of my friends put better, respawn, which is it's offering the ability for us to respawn our personas rather than kill our persons. And this, it's quite, it's really interesting. But in organizational challenges, what I've been focused on Bevry is it seems there's ways of getting, like we look in terms of Facebook or in terms of Apple or Google or whatever as these big successes, right? And yet, for some reason, we're not looking at Wikipedia as a big successful technology company. But it's interesting, Wikipedia, with the Wikimedia Foundation, the Linux Foundation, these are nonprofits. And the business of a nonprofit is to capitalize intrinsic motivation towards a mission. And I think we're seeing this world right now where people are happy to forego extrinsic motivation because we don't need that much capital to thrive anymore, thanks to reduced costs. And now there's all this free movement towards intrinsic things that are bothering us. And the frontier that I see is how we capitalize or transition this intrinsic, these intuitions or into action in ways that promote this collaborative respawning. So now that so this actually works in great for the mimetic parasitism. And I think, Nick, that's the topic you want to also dive into.
Yeah, I that would certainly be a fun one to talk about. And I've probably come at it and from a fairly different angle, I would imagine.
All right. Well, let me introduce my angle for 30 seconds, and I'll hand it over to you, Nick, to take the floor. So the way I saw it was I did this tweet actually a while ago that blew up relative to my tweets blowing up, which isn't much, which is entertainment is the new modern warfare. Weapons of mass destruction no longer target the body initially, but the mind. The discipline of self-governance of one's mind, agency, has eroded into delegation to dopamine addiction providers. The battlefield is mind control and the vector is attention. Now, Matt, as someone who worked at a technological entertainment company, it seems that's maybe also what got you interested in it, which is this battle of memes. Now, Nick, handing it over to you.
Yeah, so my angle is a little weirder. I've interacted with 4 cults, one of which was consciously joined and was literally advertised itself as a cult. So there's been a number of points when you were speaking as I was listening where I was picking up little bits. Most noticeably was your experience in youth of this kind of modal switching between worldviews and realizing how much a culture that we're interacting with has such a deep effect on our kind of phenomenological context and thus our phenomenology. And this was largely how I had come about this. And it was interesting. I've kind of, using the verb. Are you familiar with Vervaeke, by the way?
I am familiar with him. I haven't gone through all of his work though. It's the meaningness, right?
Yeah. He has the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis series where he takes a cognitive science approach to. Well, yeah, it's a lot of stuff he's got going on, but yeah. So I guess the way I kind of like framed it since coming across him is I've been kind of like at that leading edge of trying to deal with the meaning crisis in a very hands-on fashion. So yeah, a lot of it was just initially going out and looking for early, people doing something that was different from the standard. A lot of it even just came about from like wanting to learn basic skills, like, you know, how to grow food and permaculture and that type of stuff. And I came across quite a number of very interesting groups of people in the process of it. And probably most noticeably was the last one I encountered, the one where I joined consciously, and how deep the impact of encountering a novel memeplex that I did not have any antibodies for, how very powerful that was on my psychology. And it is interesting too, because perhaps to one of your earlier points too, is like I'd done some pretty serious work building up a mimetic immune system, if you will. So I had imagined myself perhaps safer than I necessarily was. And then I also wonder how far to generalize that, because as I kind of look at the culture, it seems like in many ways we have relied so strongly on one specific set of tools that we have deeply atrophied our ability to make use of the tools that actually help us in these much more mimetic spaces. Yeah, so, you know, when I was trying to process my experience going through these kinds of transformations and the reculturization towards the dominant culture, which I also found very interesting because it felt very much like optionally taking on a foreign memeplex. Again, it did not feel like a natural reassumption of, you know, whatever my person was. Oh man, I lost the question. Damn it. Oh, that's frustrating. I'm sorry.
While you think of it, the movie Inception, that is actually about mimetic immune systems, which is, you know, they go into the mind while people are sleeping for business or sales purposes, whatever, or ideological propaganda purposes. But that defense where they build out the guns and everything, that's the person's mimetic immune system. And
Right.
the multiple layers they have to get through, that's how well developed. So that's why the people in business in that movie had developed very good mimetic immune systems against foreign parasites.
Right.
So it's fascinating.
And I did remember I was just going to describing these experiences. I'd used the term mimetic possession because it did almost feel like it had a will of its own in a Jungian sense. Might be stretching Jung a little bit, but as if the archetypal structure was its own thing and it was able to impress itself upon you know, my sense of will. But yeah,
I mean, were these communities that you spent physical time in? Were these actually, like, you know, physically located communities that you were embedded within physically, or
the first three
communities, or?
And the fourth, which was the one that literally called itself a cult, was online only. And I actually left right when they started doing in real life stuff. So I never actually met up with them in real life, other than like visiting a few of the members, or rather having them visit. The other three, I was physically embedded in them and did not know what they were until I showed up at their door.
Yeah, I mean, it's been fascinating to try to. I mean, I asked that because I've also spent time in certain communities that were attempting to, I suppose, in their own words, sort of reinvent social mechanisms of communal collaboration, creation, and sustainable living, right? But in sort of like radically reinventive ways. And the interesting element that I always, well, not always, but something that I noticed as I engaged with this, it wasn't a permanent community. Although the community was permanent, but the event was, there were multiple events in the year, but there was a large event every summer that consisted in building certain types of infrastructure. And, you know, it wasn't Burning Man, it was a much smaller thing, but there's a similar vibe, but it was on the water. So it was actually quite isolated. in its own right, and we had these sort of large floating communities and structures and networks. And the fascinating thing that I always observed or tended to observe over the years is that when there's this tension between attempting to, like, well, why do we do this? First of all, it's, well, we're part of this large, the default quote unquote mode of reality. We're part of this hyper efficient, extremely large structure of our economically driven day-to-day reality that often in its needs for, in the fact, insofar as it needs to be efficient, it often it oftentimes shaves off, the identity of the members that it uses as cogs, or that uses as parts that need to conform to particular shapes in its geometry, so to speak, right? And so you might have all these inconvenient little protuberances, but for the purposes of day-to-day life in the economic reality, all those get pruned off, and then there's this well-oiled thing that's working. And so we feel that, right? All these elements of ourselves are ignored or not engaged with, or they atrophy, right? And so it's like, well, I have this deep inertial, or this deep sort of tension, this drive, this need to re-engage with a smaller community, right? To go down to a lower Dunbar scale, so to speak, right? This idea of like wanting to go back to this space that the sort of gestation space of culture, right? The space in which you have a lot more vectors, degrees of freedom to work with. But the thing that it seems that oftentimes most people are unprepared for is that as soon as you do that, because our evolutionary trajectories or inertia is so powerful, a lot of the same problems begin to reemerge in those spaces. And you really develop a very deep appreciation, or at least I don't know if you felt this way as well, but no matter how much the rhetoric says one thing or the mimetic infrastructure says one thing about what that space is supposed to be, the thing that you tend to see is that there seem to be these elements of these human universals, so to speak, or these fundamental game theoretic realities that are inescapable, that reassert themselves continuously and usually catalyze a lot of the drama in those spaces. And at least for me, that is the sort of window through which I saw the distance, just how wide the gap was between the rhetoric and the ideological language and the actual enacted behavior of the person-to-person interactions. And then also, like, there is the fundamental reality that there are certain things that these if a cult were to become a culture, right, it would need to satisfy some pretty wide set of needs, and do so in a way that actually not only satisfied the base needs that are provided by the sort of default society outside of it, but that also recognize those individual characteristics at a far higher level, such that it would attract people away in large numbers. And so, like, but that seems to be a fundamental tension. I mean, these were the things that I felt. I don't know if your experience resonated with that or not, but
dead on. And it is interesting. It seems like what you are hinting to is almost like a dynamic convergent mode, almost. We can't quite just naively call it convergent, because it does very much seem to change, as we look back through human history. Granted, there are motifs that are seemingly very deeply entrenched. And yet there is some deep sense in which it is legitimately convergent, in that if you do not have a space for these drives and do not figure out a necessary pathway for them to take, you do end up just over and over again reinventing the same wheel. Is that what you're getting at, or did I?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And I mean, and not only are you reinventing it, but also you might not be as well prepared to deal with the side effects as normal society is, right? I mean, it's one thing when it's easy to fall back on 200 years of common law in terms of what to do with somebody who has dramatically breached the social taboos. But it's another thing to do so in a context where the ideals or the ideological or the mimetic norms of that society just have not yet had to grapple with that problem, right?
Absolutely.
Like, what does the first murder look like in a space that is I mean, this is relevant to today because you see things like the Chaz/Chop in Seattle, and it is an example of this sort of revolutionary utopianism. It is a sort of cult in its own right, in the sense that
Absolutely.
there's quite usually a massive gap in people's mental models of what it takes to establish and sustain a stable human space, versus what almost immediately or invariably emerges when people begin to experiment with radical shifts to those norms. And yet humanity, our inertia, our mimetic and biological inertia, is something that doesn't go away. It is a sort of, just like gravity, you can say all you want about, changing it or it being malleable, and it is to some extent malleable, but there are elements that will reassert themselves. And so, I mean, that's the interesting thing, like the connection between this and the mimetic parasitism topic, to circle all the way back to that, is this notion that I think that there are certain types of, so like even going one step back further to the slime mold, if you look at the slime mold model of exploring sort of radially or exploring a space to try to understand where the actual nutrient points are, and then pruning itself back efficiently once it finds those pockets, wouldn't it be nice if you could, if you could trick that slime mold, if you could trick that algorithm into doing work for you, right? If you could step outside of it, right? If you could gain an information advantage on it and start placing nutrient packets in a place, like kind of like the old archetype of, like, if you've seen those cartoons of like putting little pieces of food or breadcrumbs in front of some a kid or whatever, and like follows it. Well, what is that dynamic? That dynamic is an adult who has a much larger spatiotemporal model of reality, able to leverage that spatiotemporal model to guide the behavior of some other entity in that space without that entity necessarily knowing it, through an intermediary mechanism that is innocent or attractive enough to be almost completely devoid of any threat to the person being manipulated, right? And this is so much of what's happening in our mimetic reality, in the sense that we have these spaces that we're increasingly spending so much time in, where any given incremental interaction doesn't necessarily seem threatening, and it's actually quite hard to convince someone that it is fundamentally threatening. And yet, the more time people spend in these spaces, the more you can speak to them about this sort of welling sense of dread or waste, or this sense of detachment from a biological sense, a very biological sense of meaning, right? In the sense that, like, you can spend 8 hours in front of a computer screen interacting with human beings, and yet your body, the sort of actual biological reality that your body is, thinks you've been completely sedentary all day, right? And so there's a dissonance there. There's this sort of tension there, and not only that, but like, not only are you sitting in a physical space and being sedentary oftentimes, but you're also having like either these massive dopamine reward circuits triggered, or various types of other fear or threat detection mechanisms, and all of the sort of neurohormonal cascades that come along with those. And so your endocrine system is hyper dysregulated, and all these things are happening. And yet it's still hard to convince people that every single one of those little breadcrumbs, every single one of those little pieces of candy is actually of a sufficient level of threat in the emergent frame of reference that the entire society could collapse under the weight of this parasitism, right? Because a parasite, like parasitism in nature, like if you look at parasitism, like what happens when the animal being parasitized gets sick? The parasites understand that, and they, jump off and look for a new host, right? This is the issue, is that like what does it mean? Like, what does it mean when there is no new host to jump to? Like, if you parasitize democracy such that it crumbles, where are you going to jump next, right? If you parasitize, 2,000 years of incremental development, and suck the last drop of blood from that, in terms of like its creative lifeblood, its ability to create in a resilient sense, or incorporate in a resilient sense new information in a way that is not totalitarian, and you become much more attracted to this model of if you are willing to arbitrage that short-term capital from that parasitization, and then because you're willing to also fall back on something like a more authoritarian model as well, like that's how you begin to see certain institutions in our world as these sort of containers for mimetic parasitism because of their economic incentives, right? And so like that's a very interesting, it's a very interesting dynamic, right? It's like it's
right. Two things came to mind when you were speaking there. Perhaps the more accessible is just the analogy of these types of candies left in a row, and how very easy it is for our our values to be hijacked in such a way. So it's right. This perhaps was another major part of Peterson's message, was realizing that these values that so much look like a perfectly clean, wrapped in plastic piece of glowing candy have a very dark underside beneath them. And it's really easy for us to follow that chain into a territory way outside of well, I mean, this is literally a very old story, right? It's Hansel and Gretel, or like
yep, exactly. Exactly.
There's also Little Red Riding Hood as well, with the wolf being the parasite.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, even today, like I was going through, I forgot even what brought it up on my mind, but I was looking at like the story of Prometheus, and I think even that story can be seen through this lens to some extent, right? Because like the initial setup, I think it was in the Theogony, I could be wrong in that. The initial setup of this was that, that Zeus was like, okay, well, I need a sacrifice from humanity. And so, bring me this sacrifice. And Prometheus brings these two possible sacrifices that are supposed to set the precedent.
The bones and fat and the meat. Yeah.
And one of them has the appearance of substance, but nothing nourishing inside. And the other is where, he hides all of the nourishing meat underneath the facade of like the skin that is not attractive, right? And then so what happens, right? So like he's then put into like he's punished, right, with this eternal recurrence of suffering, which is quite a nice metaphor for sort of our relationship with entropy and creativity, and the way that those two things sort of fight against one another in an eternal process of rejuvenative suffering, right? But then, interestingly enough, like also, he has a brother, Epimetheus, right? So he's pro is forethought, and then Epimetheus is like hindsight or afterthought, and Epimetheus is tricked into marrying the creation of Zeus, which is Pandora, right? And so like through this whole cycle of punishment and this whole process of attempting to sort of trick the god or the universe into giving you some extra space to get away with your sort of like nice energy and meat, you end up sacrificing, or you end up basically with this situation in which some people who don't have the foresight, who only have the hindsight, ending up opening Pandora's box, right? And that is sort of these existential risks or threat profiles. And so it's like, there's
I love in that story though too. Elpis is the last thing to come out of Pandora's box.
Yeah, exactly,
the spirit of hope, right?
Yeah. Well, but that's the thing. It's like, well, what it's the rose that grew from concrete, right? If
right.
you want to go, to the Tupac poetry dimension, right? But like that's the interesting thing. Where it's like, well, okay, yeah. After all of, if you go that far, I mean, at least thus far, it doesn't matter how far we've fallen. There's always been a seed of new growth, right? The question is just how far do we need to fall, and like have we gone to such heights that a fall now is non-recoverable, right? Or certain, we're about to enter a space in which certain types of falls may be non-recoverable for all of life for many millions of years, right? Like,
are we in the Prometheus myth or the Icarus myth?
Sure. Yeah, exactly.
And this perhaps leads into another interesting territory, which was the second point I wanted to bring up, which is I'm also a moderator in Vervaeke's Discord group.
I actually have to head off, but nice meeting you, Matthew, and nice talking with you guys. Sorry. See you guys though.
Great speaking with you as well. Take it easy.
Hey, John. Thanks so much.
And one of, if not Vervaeke's main project, is posing this religion that's not a religion. So he's trying to recover religio within a secular frame. And so far, most of the work has just been by random people that have been attracted to such a concept. And I, having had the background I've had, have seemingly played a pretty sobering role so far of trying to wake people up to what it is that they're actually doing, because there is this generalized sense that these, you know, religio structures, almost pre-religious structures, are vastly more powerful than we think they are, and that naively playing in that space is going to, well, we are far more likely to end up like the witch in Hansel and Gretel than we are, you know, legitimately creating something new. And so in the same idea of like, okay, well, what's that spirit of hope that exits Pandora's box last, right? What do you see as like, how do you move forward from where we're at, where it seems like the dominant culture has legitimately lost something? So it's making this ranging for these novel sources of, or perhaps not even novel, but these sources of nutrients that we've been starved of for a while. It's making us very hungry for them and very willing to take existential risk in pursuit of them. How do we navigate that situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's that is the question, right? I think there's so many challenges in it, but one of the core challenges, or I mean, perhaps the core challenge, is this question of once you believe, like once your belief becomes characterized by a cynicism towards belief, right? And most people would never admit that that is a belief in and of itself. But it becomes very difficult to regain the ability to believe in anything that is not imminent or that is not empirically provable, right? And then like we've built so much, like, it's interesting because like I don't think you can't jump, because you're dealing with all these combating immune systems. Like you can't just jump back into like this. In so many ways, the new atheists had tried to deal with this by just saying we're going to try to jump into a space where we can remove ourselves from any necessity of belief, where we can say that like there's there's a foundation of ethics that is recoverable from empirical epistemology. And
they smashed their heads against Hume for forever since.
Yeah, but precisely. I mean, and so this is the question: is like in some ways, I mean, at least from my perspective, like I resonate far more with the pragmatists, especially people like Pierce, in the sense that like in many ways it's like, okay, so if you look at, and then also the Nietzschean eternal recurrence points at this, and many elements that sort of that beg the question of, okay, well, assuming that there is no finitude, assuming that you need to understand what it looks like to have anything speakable within an infinite context, right? How do you what does it mean to have moral or pragmatic stepping stones that emerge out of a process that that isn't necessarily converging to a deductive point, right?
Right.
And so like what is an emergent ethic, right? And that's why one of the reasons why people like Peterson were interesting to me in the past, because he was talking about ethics. Like I had studied a lot of like the foundations of emergent morality in evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, and to me, it's when we're talking about religion, when we're talking about these grammars that we think we've moved beyond, the reason we think we've moved beyond them in some ways is because we have not. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but I came back to their wisdom because the only way out was through for me. I kept pushing past the limits of known knowledge in terms of the game theory and the psychology and the behavioral economics. And then I fell into a space where I was like, oh my God, there's an immense symmetry between the encodings of this mythopoetic space and where it looks like a lot of these fields are headed, right? And so it's like, for me at least, it's like, how can you then, really then it's like, how do you set the ground for fertile interactions to happen between people who might otherwise engage in more combative interactions and therefore miss the opportunity for information to flow between these domains, right? And how do you actually identify the people also, because it's not as if every voice in the scientific or the mythopoetic or religious domain are voices that are not everyone's sort of holding the flame, carrying the flames, like the truest flames in the sense of like what is most beautiful about the scientific tradition or what is most beautiful and true about the religious tradition. Not everyone is animated by that spirit, so to speak, right? And so how do we identify those who may be expressing this spirit in different forms, but do share this spirit of curiosity and are seeking for truth deeply enough such that they are willing to find any, that they are willing to engage with anyone who holds any part of it, right? And so much of that seems to do with finding ways of demonstrating what those connections are. Like, can we actually, like, that's why I've been so really interested by like, can we actually articulate which, like can we actually articulate the game theory of religion? Could you prove, for example, like one thing that I think you can prove, and I think I do have something close to a proof of that I haven't really shared. It's like, I do think that you can prove that if you have a mimetic spread, a mimetic saturation of the idea, if you have a package that contains the idea of forgiveness such that it actually parameterizes behavior past a certain point, it actually puts whatever society is infected by that meme into a state in which they're far more likely to play something like an optimized tit for tat strategy and therefore outcompete most of the other societies in the landscape, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like, if you can make that argument and you can really draw a strong connection between encoding the idea of forgiveness mythopoetically and the emergent evolutionary game theory advantages in terms of generating resilient, stable societies that are capable of not collapsing upon themselves, but also resisting parasitization by defection and by invasion, you can actually start having people in the religious communities who are simply going to, they're going to go to their grave believing that, believing in certain very literal aspects of this that, who knows, but we don't have evidence for, right? And it's hard to have a conversation about that. It's hard to set the stage for the next level wherever we're going if we can't actually stand on shared ground or common ground together. So, yeah.
Right. So that's a great point. Is trying to isolate those. Well, again, the image I was getting was the convergence in the corpus callosum. Right. It is. You've got that left hemisphere grounding, and here's how the law is working as like a pattern of that is necessarily emergent from the structure of what we are in, and our own structure and all that, right? And then likewise bringing in that right hemisphere of reconnecting to the phenomenological aspect and the embodied reward of living in accordance with the principle that generates life. Right, so I'm sure you can hear it even in the way I'm describing it. It has a pseudo-religious undertone, right?
Yeah.
So that's really interesting, and that's
at some point that's the only language that works, right? At some point, like when we transcend the idea of like, we can't necessarily say what the pattern is. I mean, it is amazing how uninspiring at times, for example, the origin of life research. If you read a lot of that literature, like when they're in the sort of sterile empirical language, when you're talking about the origin of life, I mean, if you zoom out, it can be quite beautiful, but fundamentally, it's not going to resonate with anybody. It's not going to paint an image. It's not going to trigger an image that is relatable to the human psyche most of the time. And so that religious language is completely called for to be able to communicate that first layer of meaning when it comes to trying to point at whatever might be the universal principle that applies to all of these different scales or processes that need to stack up, that need to align, that need to stabilize, that need to resonate with one another such that every one of those processes can actually thrive and live and continue to grow and adapt and change.
And ironically, I didn't mean to interrupt, sorry.
No, go for it, go for it.
Ironically, that is, you could very much consider that a pragmatic argument, in the sense that our phenomenology is necessarily what's closest to us. So if we assume pragmatically our own frame, there is a kind of emergent order to how this develops. And it's not to say it's not to say it's a metaphysical order, right? It's not an well, metaphysic is the right word there. But it is, in some sense.
Well, we've been very much in this correspondence domain of truth, but I really do think that we're about to enter or re-enter or see a resurgence of sort of more of the coherence principles of truth and the coherence theories of truth.
Okay, yeah. Oh, I like that. Oh, that's interesting, because I've played with that in bizarrely different realms while trying to play with getting through the postmodern problem, as opposed to reversing out of it or naively assuming it. But that's you know, the way I've structured it, and the way it looks like what's happening is that you get these echo chamber pockets. Here's our different mold categories, if you will, and in some sense they're fundamentally competing, at least initially, internally, in that there's some internal game of creating a coherence form of truth through its kind of ontological layers. And then that is primarily what we're judging the health of these pseudo-cultic structures on, because we've actually lost the correspondence sense of truth, right? We have a kind of, in Vervaeke speak, a combinatorial explosion of truths that we can no longer map all the correspondences to. So we are falling back on perhaps a different system of truth, which is this coherence. And to my mind, what you end up with is something like, as these kind of internally reliable mold cultures grow, they will necessarily start competing and interacting with each other, perhaps in pursuit of certain resources. And it would allow, ideally, a pragmatic, competitive and collaborative, right? I think it's useful in this case that competitive systems like capitalism have a tendency to form monopolies, except that this would be quite literally a monopoly based on the pragmatic game of truth. Starting from a coherence definition of truth. I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm painting a clear picture here.
Let me try to catch the ball and you know, juggle for a little while as well. I mean, we're definitely in space where the language doesn't yet really, it's not really settled, it doesn't exist that well. But I mean, one other way of thinking about this that I think relates to what you're saying is you might think about the fact that, like, let's say that there's a certain amount that combinatoric possibility space is all, you could look at that as an information space, right? In terms of like what is possible, in terms of what is possible in terms of what is, because possibility is an interesting word in and of itself. Possibility requires an observer, and it requires the interaction with the space of the given space, the given external space, because possibility implies action. So there needs to be something that can be acted upon, and then therefore there would need to be an actor. And the actor is the state of the observer that has chosen to act, right, in alignment with some sort of goal in the future space, right? So we're already saying that there's this possibility space. That possibility space is an information space. We have an actor, an observer, or an observer attempting to understand action. One might say that the correspondence theory, or a correspondence theory of truth, can scale with a society up into a certain threshold past which that society requires the information that would otherwise be lost in the multitude of perspectives, right? The multitude of observers, right? Because there's, if you look at a correspondence theory depends upon getting rid of certain information about that possibility space that is the information from all of the different perspectives. And it's like, what is the shared part of the Venn diagram that everyone can agree upon all of the time, right? And the correspondence theory of truth, if you're going to build an entire ethics or society on that, what you're saying is that that is both necessary and will always be sufficient for whatever adaptive capacity you might need.
Oh,
right?
Interesting. Okay.
But that might not be true, right? The other possibility is that actually, whether you consider something true or not in terms of correspondence, the information held by other observers, even if you don't consider it true along the lines of correspondence, might be necessary for sufficient adaptive capacity at a particular point. And I think that point has a lot to do with the ambient complexity of the network within which you exist. So I would say periods of high relative complexity are periods in which you need to shift from correspondence models of reality, oftentimes to coherence models of reality, because it's more important to stitch the behavior of the network and the flows within the network together than it is to have a fixed model, right? So yeah, that's
really interesting. But it seems like then, so would I be wrong, or am I misapplying this then by saying that switch to the coherence is naturally going to pocketize worldviews? Because you're gonna start basically looking for the worldviews where you can actually form a coherent sense of truth, where the the bits we're chopping off in the correspondence definition of truth are also overlapping.
So I think, I mean, it's interesting because I think that we're already seeing like the technologies we've created, the network technologies, the networking technologies we created have already bound with, together with our psychological or evolutionary inertia, have already given rise to a topology that is a sort of scale-free set of worldviews and micro realities, right? And yet, if you're given that space to work with, and then you're still operating on a phenomenological operating system of correspondence theory of truth, you're going to see an immense amount of conflict because because immediately then those network attractors find themselves phenomenologically in a sort of zero-sum battle for correspondence binding, right? And they want to totalize the correspondence binding.
Right.
But if we're already given a topology of this pocketed, fragmented reality, which, I mean, whether we like it or not, we have right now. I mean, this is the whole idea of echo chambers, right? Exactly. And there's not just two, there's, a whole fractal set of them.
Yes.
So I look at correspondence theory of truth and shifting toward that theory of truth as a primary epistemic model as the only way out in many ways, not just out, but up in many also, because it's like, if you can get you can also think of, this is kind of analogous to many theories of the origins of life, which is like, if you get enough pieces and their inputs and outputs configured in the right shape, you get some sort of emergent structure that can sustain itself at a higher level in a new ecosystem in a way that the previous systems, the previous disintegrated systems could not, right? And then if you reemerge at that next level, then you can once again reintroduce much more of the correspondence perspectives because you've sort of established a much higher level of the capacity to cohere as a singular unit. That introduces other questions about individual consciousness or autonomy, but
it does. And I guess somewhere where my mind is hanging up is, where is the coherence taking place? Is this like a meta level, or which direction is that?
I think it's functional. That's why I love I probably overuse the term, but I think the term autocatalytic is something that everyone should understand. It's the fundamental reality that drives mutualism, which is, splits into parasitism and symbiotic relations, right? And so autocatalysis, it's like auto, self, and then catalyzing, right? So like self-enabling or self-perpetuating or self-amplifying, in the sense that you could characterize, like, let's just talk about it in the context of our conversation, right? I am forming symbols that can be interpreted in your mind in a way that could, in theory, generate something that comes back from you that strengthens and keeps this flow of information going and amplifies it, and increasingly gives us higher and higher resolution bindings to one another's psyche, and therefore we can increasingly shorten, use like use shorthand without losing information, right?
Right.
And so this would be this process of an autocatalytic relation where we're self-reinforcing through some reciprocal flow, right? And in our case, it would be language and information and symbols. But you can talk about this in terms of eukaryotic cells. You can talk about this in terms of economic entities. You can talk about this in terms of many different types of systems. But what it fundamentally requires is that you get a sort of closure. People like often call it like a Kantian closure, right? Between the pieces of a system and the way that their inputs and outputs lock them into a higher order form. And so this question of correspondence truth would be like, whatever allows us as a society with the given amounts of diversity perspective that we have in the topology of that network, whatever allows us to functionally cohere that network in a way that meets the needs of the coming century could in theory allow for us to emerge as some higher order kind of entity. I mean, I think we're starting to see it. I mean, I think Neuralink is really interesting for that reason. I mean, once you choose high bandwidth mind-to-mind communication, you get the because I think it's sensitive. I think there's a phase. I think there's a sort of like tipping point, to use the colloquial term. I think there's a sort of threshold beyond which you need to be able to. What we're missing right now is we have the speed, right? But we don't have the bandwidth. We can send information on Twitter at the speed of light, but it is an extremely low bandwidth communication. And because of that, oftentimes that communication takes much more the form of a weapon than it does a nutritive flow. Right. If you open that bandwidth up, you open the ability to have far more sort of reciprocally nutritive flows between the members of a society. Shared states, like right now, the only state we seem to share is probably rage as a society.
The 1984 10 minutes hate or whatever.
Well, yeah, because it's the simplest. I mean, it's like one of the simplest emotions to trigger. One of the simplest emergent emotions, right? It's the egregore will first display rage before it is capable of displaying anything more sophisticated, right? We have, this is pitchfork mobs. We have stories, of this that go back hundreds or thousands of years. It is not unique to our technological reality that we are able to connect people such that they can express low resolution rage together. What would be interesting or unique is structuring our flows of information, our internal and external, or our internal states, as well as our ability to communicate those states to one another, such that we were able to express collectively a much wider range of physical states, emotional states, so to speak, and ideally, thought. Yeah, that would be nice.
And it is interesting, even just relating it to what we're doing right here, right? You brought up the example of Twitter, and it usually is the example because it literally, not only does it limit it largely to text, but it even limits the amount of text. So you got like multiple layers there. But compared to this, where we're able to see each other's faces, we're able to see the body language, hear the words, hear the inflection, right? There's so much more information coming through, and it almost always in these types of exchanges, even in disagreement, it takes on a far more constructive form. And that's a great point to just put that squarely at the feet of the bandwidth. That's very interesting.
I mean, like imagine if you felt the feelings of everyone who read your tweets.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point.
For the risk of or the hope for turning this from a monogamous mimetic bonding session into a polyamorous mimetic bonding session.
We're increasing the autocatalytic complexity.
Yeah. Well, actually, the language I use there is actually going to tie into it. So I've been thinking about love for a while because this is a low bandwidth word for high amount of complex terminology. And so I've come to a few different understandings of what love means. And the first one is it's
You're saying love or life?
Love. Like
love, okay.
LOVE. My Australian accent is throwing you off. Yeah, so love can be a virtue signaling to a normative ideal. So when you're in a relationship, why is it so important to hear I love you? Because it signals to the other person you're playing the same game. And that's incredibly bonding. But the other aspect of it is, well, we also say we love an idea or we hate an idea. And in this, I think what it is when we love a person or when we love an idea, that idea is now autonomous within our own mind. It's now generating more ideas. It's like a fission reaction. When we think about someone we love in that blossoming romance, we're thinking about them on itself. They've now inserted themselves in our head and it's causing more and more thoughts. And we like those thoughts. We want to nurture and sustain them. Whereas something we hate, something we loathe, we have rage to, is actually the same operation. It's something that's fallen into our head and it's generating more and more cycles in of itself. When choosing, like we don't have a choice over that propagation depending on your level of mindfulness. So what we want to do instead is we want to eradicate that autonomy. We want to eradicate the thing we hate and its control over our agency. So like love is something we like this autocratic bonding or this is autonomous emergent reaction fission thing. I'm a simpleton. I don't know the complex terminology. Yeah, in regards to this, but that's the conception that I have of it.
So I think that that's it's really interesting because I think it leads me to the idea of like probably one of the best definitions of love that I've ever thought about in the sense where it's like it's almost quite simply the yearning for a state of permanence of whatever you're applying that term to. It's something that's like you feel like your exposure to that state is such that you wish for it to remain a thing in the world for all of time. Whereas rage, like you're saying, is the exact opposite, which is like, I wish for this to be terminated as soon as possible. And I'm willing to do almost anything to terminate it, regardless of the side effects of that. Which is really, I mean, it's like, because then it's like, and if love means yearning for sort of infinite permanence of something in reality, then, I mean, at least I would probably assert that the only way for something to be permanent is for it to become a self-sustaining, self-perpetuating, self-regenerating process, right? And so it's like, if you love someone, the only way for that love to perpetuate itself is for it to flow through you into your children, into the generations, into perpetuity, and for that to expand outwards to further bring into the world the things that are phenomenologically desirable for, as permanent fixtures of our reality, increasingly, at larger and larger scales.
Right.
Does that resonate?
Yeah, and the so I think, yeah, so that covers one half of it. The other half is just these are ideas that are autonomous and emerge new thoughts in of themselves, like the memes that are autonomous in our head, emerging new thoughts. Like it's like we're not choosing, like when we love someone, like it's like always a surprise. We're like, shit, I actually love this person. And you start thinking more and more about them and you become love blind to an extent. And it's interesting, like it's something that has possessed us and it emerges new thoughts. And whether it's something we love and we want to nurture that propagation, we wish to hate it and we just want to destroy it. I think this function of it is emerging new thoughts in ourselves is really fascinating. It's new, and we do that with conversation. Like we get a new idea and then we love that idea because it's emerging new thoughts. Each new branch it gives us a little bit more dopamine, a little bit more reward, or a little bit more cortisol, and a little bit more hatred towards that idea that is possessing us.
I mean that's a fascinating. One direction to take that is this interesting idea of just how little we often know ourselves, in the sense that there can be these elements, these thought forms welling up inside of us, emerging piecemeal on different parts of our perceptual architecture, but below the radar of our conscious recognition. And then at a given moment, it crosses that threshold and becomes something consciously describable, as you're saying, as either something that one loves or hates, something that one wants to see in perpetuity, or one wants to incorporate into their being, or something that someone wants to violently reject. And yet it can exist, or all of its pieces can exist within you without you knowing that they're going to self-assemble in that way.
I keep getting an image as well of almost like a ontological synchronization. So almost like a vertical dimension of being, and it kind of popped up in my mind describing this effect of love as this recreation cycle that it seems to arc, through time, but it's very strange how
it's non-linear, right?
Right. It's not horizontal, at least, right? It's some type of combination of this I don't know what the right word is other than ontological, because it's like being at its many layers.
Yeah. Well, I think this is relevant to even like what you're talking about or what you're showing with some of the Bevry projects, because in some ways, another way of seeing like the cyclic pattern is a sort of way of engaging with the tendencies towards divergence and the necessity of convergence in a way that precipitates out or lays down something that builds vertical layer after layer after layer that can then be, the foundation for whatever the living process is at that given point.
Right. And even for that, like one of the big learnings I've had when how to structure and progress this collaborative effort, like how to organize it, how to structure it, right, is like, say a company, like companies are so successful at building things because it's like a top-down coherence. Like this is the what is it?
The dictatorship.
The telos, yeah. And then so it's the telos, the leadership takes it, and then everyone follows it with extrinsic rewards.
Yeah.
But then you also have communities, and communities don't really build things because they're always fighting over what the telos should be, what the ethos should be. So so there's this hybrid in between, and it seems like it's an open company or a cooperative or a non-profit, which is this hybrid in between on how do we organize this effort into something, and that's something we can go into more at a later time. On this topic, just to share, and there's
Fountain
a song
is a good name.
It's a perfect name. I'm glad everyone enjoys it. This song, Talking Heads Once in a Lifetime. If you're not familiar with this is fascinating. They talk about this water underground that keeps pulling us under. And this is one of the songs you hear as a kid and you don't have no idea. And then you lived a few traumatic life experiences, and like, you just wake up one day and you go through everything he talks about in the song. You're like, geez. There's like this, our mind is just assembling itself. And then one day it seized it. And it's fascinating.
I literally just sent that song to somebody for these exact reasons the other day, which this is an interesting little bit of synchronicity. But if you want a formal term, if you want a formal scientific term where there's some good research on this topic to map to what you just described, there's this idea of explosive percolation, which is the idea of small clusters of information or systems connecting and then forming that sort of layer of potential. And then there's this point at which those clusters begin to connect to each other, and that happens almost instantaneously, and it explodes to this next level of observational reality. So you might enjoy looking into that.
Well, it's
also related to mold, right? Because it's actually like by the time you see the day, by the day or the moment at which you start seeing the actual fruiting bodies of the mold spores, pushing up above the bread, for example, that bread is thoroughly penetrated by that mold, right? Because it follows these kind of dynamics.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I actually asked this of Cora when I saw that video, which is there a noun for the water flowing underground that unconsciously influences our behavior and complexes and collapses us into catharsis or hugot, which is a Filipino term. So you can finally answer my Cora question. But that's so this is cool. So I want to tie in some other things while you guys were riffing away. So one of the things is I've showed back my Chrome screen. So we've covered like diversity in a part, but also and travel and this idea of mimetic coherence or even structural organizational coherence. Now, one of the things we did on Bevry is we went through like a lot of Eastern videos. I've spent a lot of time in Asia myself, and we covered a few of the World War II history, but from the Eastern perspective. But for Peterson, we also covered these few movies. And one of them was Your Name. I just felt that the movie Your Name by Makoto Shinkai, which is a great introduction to anime itself. But recently, I viewed his latest movie, which is Weathering with You. There's actually a progression here that I think we're all interested in, which is because what's surprising about Your Name is like that became the most popular like Asian export movie, like unbelievably popular. It's crazy how successful that movie became. But you try and describe that movie, and it's actually quite difficult to do so. It's operating at some layer of us that isn't particularly able to be conscious or even to be articulated. But I've watched all his movies. I'm a huge fan. And I actually realized there's a progression here, something that he's been wrestling with. And he's been wrestling with these things as a good intellectual person should do, which is publicly communicate the things you're struggling with publicly. That way people can follow you along with a journey. So his first movie here was 5 centimeters per second in this series, which he's trying to challenge this. And this one follows like a boy along his life. And there's a few times where like a woman will like him, and in a Western world we'll be like, okay, well the woman should pursue the guy, screw his career, whatever, love wins. But she doesn't, she holds back. And that's when I realized like, okay, there's a culture in Japan where it's like career comes first. And it kind of shows like a lot of the struggles in that movie, like a lot of the hurt and harm it actually causes to society, that sacrifice. So that movie is kind of like communicating the struggle of the impedance of love, the collective interest, but also the cost of the sacrificial psyche. The sacrifice being the person who sacrifices, his love for his career or sacrifices the career for love. It's doing a balanced assessment of that. But then for the movie Your Name, it's fascinating because we have it where it seems what that movie is actually about is how our forgotten desire for selfish love could save our collective. Because essentially there's this romance that is blossoming, but then this impeding Armageddon. And it was only through this romance that is very forgotten in that culture that they were actually able to save and revitalize the culture. But then at the same time, we can't just be like what the West has done with romantic love and just go to the winds and go crazy with it and have high divorce rates and all the rest. So his most recent movie that just came out this year, Weathering with You, it's actually how do we balance those two movies together? So how do we balance collective benefit and sustained individual sacrifice? And this touched on when you guys were talking about cults, which is, to some extent, to get someone to get a collective of people to collaborate, there's this cultish propaganda seizing of them. But at the same time, you have to respect their agency. You need to make sure they're not just children you're ordering around. They're actually developing into competent adults that can act on their own accord and contribute and can extend out the mold to other profitable areas. And when that movie, it kind of is like a battle between this old school hierarchy and this new youthful romance, and how do we find the balance so we don't lose ourselves and lose ourselves into these axioms that may be false. And it's fascinating how over 10 years this director has wrestled with this problem and found a solution.
So I would definitely. Oh, sorry. Go for it.
No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say that I haven't watched. I mean, I've seen a decent amount of anime. I haven't seen these, so I'm really interested in actually watching them now, and actually having the sort of primary content to map to your analysis. But I definitely resonate with that analysis or with the sort of high level conclusion and the need for synthesis between those two poles. It's something like in the essay series that I wrote, the Crypto Beyond Capitalism essay series. One of the primary sections of that is these like what was the name of it? It was like the primary dimensions of adaptation, or I forget exactly what it was, but it was basically the tension between these two primary dimensions, which are quality and time, right? Or the primary dimensions of sacrifice, quality and time, right? That's what it was. And so it's like, if you actually look at this fundamental trade-off between, high quality generally, is this type of thing that needs to be stretched across time. But if you're looking for, something short, you're often going to sacrifice that quality. And you can, this is just a very simple analysis, but you can take it quite deep in terms of understanding what those trade-offs mean for coordinative capacity in a society or in any relationship, right? Or even with respect to love. If you're talking about this idea of, let's say quality is in, the etymological sense, qualia, the experience, which would be resonating with this selfish desire for optimizing the immediate quality of that experience. And yet, if you do that, oftentimes you'll end up creating elements that fundamentally detract from your ability to have some sort of sustained relationship, right? Often, I don't know if you've had relationships like this, but some of the most emotionally volatile and sometimes satisfying in terms of generating the highest peaks, at least for me, those have certainly not been the relationships that are able to weave together in a way that develops a fabric that is both beautiful, but also has tensile strength that's strong, that isn't going to break when you have to hang a weight from it, the weight of life, the weight of suffering, right? And so there's something to this idea of sacrificing, of the necessity of sacrifice as a coordinated mechanism, right? Or like there's also the quote where it's like those societies grow best whose old men plant trees whose shade they know they'll never sit under, right? It's like you need to be able, there needs to be some willingness to throw yourself upon the sort of fire of entropy as fuel for the next generation, for the continuation, the continuity of what you love, right? And that's something I worry about a lot with sort of this sort of surge with respect to desire for immortality, for example, that is becoming relatively popular, or just the very idea of life extension, because I think and I used to be an advocate in many ways and very into this culture, but I began to realize,
I
at least
think
in my own
every
life,
young person was an advocate.
Yeah, exactly. But then you begin to realize that at least in my own life, even at an unconscious level, the idea, the meme in my head of the possibility of extending life forever was dramatically inhibiting my ability to value every moment. And so, and also like, because I didn't need to figure out what I was going to sacrifice myself for, I wasn't sacrificing myself for anything. And so, that was a sort of reckoning that I had to come to.
That's so interesting, because I had a similar experience of the same phenomena from the other direction, on the Xeno side of infinity, which was right as a young teenager. I was obsessed with photography, and that too is a bizarre type of questing after a form of immortality, to capture some whatever you're capturing, but it has this permanence that seems to extend far outside of the moment in which it occurred. And I eventually realized by the time I was like 17 or 18 that I had lost the ability to actually enjoy my life, just because I was constantly thinking of how to preserve the moment that I could not myself experience. It was really bizarre. So I ended up getting rid of my camera and never got into photography again. But
what does that look like, or what does that mean at the scale of billions of people? And we're going to find out, because
right.
You're describing everyone's relationship to Instagram.
Exactly. That is really interesting. Yeah.
I mean, there are certainly elements, there are certainly ways in which it makes our life more rewarding, but there is a very real question in terms of what it means to why are we really doing it? And everyone will tell you that they're doing it for their own personal reasons, but there is an underlying context, an underlying incentive landscape that has a lot to do with the fact that it's just the simplest way to make money from attention. And that is, and so it's so not only is there a first order mimetic parasitism of explicit ideologies, but there's a second order capacity to structure the actual landscape of behavior, the systems and the realities in which people interact, such that they are more susceptible to mimetic parasitism if it generates profit.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's terrifying in a lot of ways.
Well,
right?
It is an obsession with quantifying qualia in some very bizarre way. Even the attention itself, because I think for most people, it's not even coming down to money. It's just coming down to the number of likes, which has become, in some deep sense, its own currency. Right? It's operating in some bizarre sense in our minds.
I mean,
like a currency
for some
does.
increasing number of people, they have a translation layer that translates that into liquid currency in the primary economy, right? But it's an interesting question in terms of like, just because one can doesn't necessarily mean one should, right? Just because one can become an Instagram influencer does not necessarily mean that is the highest realization of one's potential. Just because one can take their PhD in physics and apply it to Wall Street high frequency trading algorithms doesn't mean that is necessarily the highest realization of their potential. Yet we have developed a society that is very much willing to sacrifice, to place the long-term potential and the long-term beauty of possibility upon the sacrificial pyre in service of generating as much sort of self-aggrandizing signal mechanisms as possible, right? And like, whomever can generate the largest pile of these will be glorified the most. And we've had that culture for, I don't know, at least 50 years now, to some extent longer. But
well, there's a death
I don't think
spiral.
It's not sustainable.
There's a death spiral effect, because when you start doing that, you actually start collapsing the system that affords you to see future potentials.
Yeah.
And then it makes it so that people don't know what to aim for. So they have little option but to seek the short term. And then that keeps repeating until you're totally blind of any long-term potentials. And that's the most obvious and seemingly only path of behavior, is the immediate self-aggrandizing.
And actually we can even take that and we can connect it right back to what we were talking about earlier with correspondence versus coherence in some ways, because the way that we view money at the moment and monetary representation is much more in line with this correspondence theory of value, right? Where it's like, oh, if you're holding a large pile of money, that corresponds with your actual value. That's the proxy signal, right?
Right.
It doesn't matter if you got that money selling crack to 3-year-olds or educating 3-year-olds, whatever. You have the pile of money. It's absent. It's divorced from that context. There's a correspondence mapping between you and the symbols. The coherence theory of value is much different. The coherence theory of model would posit something along the line that you need to be able to functionally demonstrate your capacity and utility in the way that it integrates into a larger picture of adaptive behavior within this more complex structure, right? And then there's this debate of like, well, does that limit freedom? To some extent, it can, but actually in some of the ways that it does, it enables a much greater freedom, right? So it's like, this is the debate. And like, I think like right now we're seeing so much of these debates in terms of words like capitalism or socialism, or words like Democrat and Republican. And these memeplexes, they're dead. They're dead on arrival. They're so polluted that there's no way out of them. They're traps. As soon as you introduce those words, it's kind of like Ice 9, right? As soon as you introduce the Ice 9 into the conversational water, boom, it's done. And then there's no liquid. It's not a liquid space. There's no way to move. Everything's frozen into its polarities just by the introduction of like these days, even like a particular way of describing an observation, right? Like you could say the word like death tax, and you already know who says that, what it means, what party it's affiliated with, what systems or processes or policies it's affiliated with, right? And it's like, how do we move from these correspondence theories? How do we move from these places where we're not able to really capture this dynamism and this adaptive necessity and all of our roles in it, to coherence models where we're actually able to see the patterns, and instead of having just very simple low-dimensional correspondence symbols associated with instead of having those symbols and keeping those symbols in a way such that they correspond with something whose history is lost, how do we understand what it means to function together in a way that is valuable, such that that value flows to those who are actually adding adding the value that is going to enable us to achieve our potential across the longest
Right.
time horizons, right? It's like teachers,
Well,
for example. Like,
Right.
well, you just look at the economy right now. Like anyone, if you look at like the kinds of labor that are not rewarded, the kinds of labor that are not rewarded economically are the kinds of labor that are critically important, yet they do not materialize in a sort of finite or easily articulatable way
Yep.
across the short term, right? Anything whose value expresses itself over long periods of time, those people are getting discounted to hell. And it's really unfortunate because that's the most necessary elements of our economic reality.
Well, why was it so easy to pull the mothers into the economic system and somehow make them think that having some high level, whatever job running a company was actually more important or more valuable than the role of being a great parent? It seems fairly obvious. It's because we never had a system of value that represented the value that we necessarily rely on. It's that bizarre effect of like our axioms sliding underneath the surface. We're not able to recognize them in the moment until we throw them out on accident without realizing we had thrown them out.
At the same time, it's a little bit like of American or Western arrogance. Because like say in the East, that transition to a feminine workforce is incredibly difficult, but because they highly value motherhood, incredibly. So it's really interesting, interesting there.
Well, can we refine that a little bit in terms of just instead of it being specifically like gender concept, like I think you can abstract it to something that actually isn't quite, is slightly different pattern. So like if you think of it actually as like it's a different form of emergent parasitism in many ways. So what we really see is that we saw the emergence of large scale centralized organizations. And what you first saw was the men from the farm or the agricultural reality that were closer to the land and the family and all of those structures be sucked into that first, right? And then they were convinced in some ways by certain mimetic structures that this was the way to the top of the hierarchy, that this was the primary value in the society, right? You wanted to get the biggest stacks of money, you wanted to get the best corner office, yada, 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 yada. There are many men in society, including myself, who went up corporate hierarchies to some extent and then said, this is not at all what I want. I don't value this. I don't think that these symbols and this way of expressing value, it doesn't square with the way I see the world at all. So I need to find a different way of like operating the world. And so I just think like, you can look at it in many ways as like, this flow happened for some reasons first with men, but I think it's very much happening with women as well, in the sense where more and more people who are moving their way up into the corporate hierarchy are eventually getting to a particular place and realizing like, this is dehumanizing. This actually doesn't satisfy my deep human needs. I want to go back, like I want to find a connection with community. I want to find a connection with family. I want to find a connection with meaning. There is that time lag and there are all sorts of reasons for that. And that might be a conversation for a different day. But I do think that like, one of the deeper conversations that needs to be had is like, what does it mean to move back into a way of life that is both economically sustainable, but also much sort of smaller scale and more closely connected to process of life.
Right.
So I wonder about this because like maybe then like the East versus West comparison here, like perhaps because the West of its individualist, what do you call it, fortitude, it forgot that in the same way, like for religion, like it forgot the value of religion and then it went into like a lot of Mormons, they leave Mormon church and they go straight to SJW ideology. And then they have the same type of axiomatic challenges again and again. And it's until they realize like, okay, I'm an independent, I should integrate, piece by piece with things rather than just find these collectives. I should try and find that conversion to collaborative wisdom. But at the same time, I think whereas on the East, the struggle is the opposite, where there is such respect for roles. Like there is such a respect for the breadwinner, there is such a respect for the nurturer or the family goer, the rearer,
the company man.
But even for the woman though, there's this incredible respect, but they find it incredibly hard to actually express their individuality. And that's all the way from choosing a marriage partner to, sacrificing the career for a romance to choosing alternative careers. There's this hard thing where for them, the struggle is actually coming from a different place where it's like, they're struggling with learning the things the West kind of learned, but at the same time, the West is kind of struggling to learn the things that the East still knows, which is the value of these roles. And to that extent, one of the things, the last thread I want to weave into this conversation while we have time is there's a theory I've been contemplating for a while, but I don't have the aptitude to write a paper about it, but I really wish I did. I hope to be able to at some point. But it's the idea of economic morality, which is morality follows what is economical. And when something ceases to be economical, it ceases to be moral. And this would make a lot of sense, which is that if something is not economical and we make it moral, then that will be wiped out in a few generations. Whereas if something now becomes economical, then we induce morality, which is tools of shame and modesty, these cultural incentives to then manifest that economical behavior. So we can see this, like, say, for the workplace. We move this, like, say, for Silicon Valley, this is something myself and you can relate to, Matt, which is in any area where there's a new frontier, you have highly disagreeable men who are optimizing for high risk, high reward. And then it becomes stable, and then we move in more agreeable talent, and we set in procedures so they can get along. And then right now we're seeing, as the tech industry has stabilized itself and now welcomes any talent, the disagreeable people, even men and women, have moved in mass to crypto, which is this new frontier, or to AI or whatnot. And then eventually that frontier will stabilize itself and start welcoming in junior talent more readily, and with onboarding apprenticeships, formal structures. But then at the same time, when we work it into these career choices, we have this idea of, like, okay, it's kind of like women are coming to terms with manhood in the West. And the more conservative religious women, they've had a culture that has embedded that respect. But then progressive, or liberal, seems to be the dominant ideology of the West, there was the overwhelming cultural idea was that the women were oppressed by the power structures that be. And that's a way of seeing the world through social power. But that way of seeing the world is an agreeable and also feminine mating strategy, which is to use my limited fertility window to acquire as much wealth as possible. So it's always ways of looking for wealth and power. So when they see the world or go into companies or whatever it is, the focus is always on this wealth and power. And again, these are broad generalizations because these are general observations, right? But it seems now there's kind of coming to be a little bit more, and we saw this after, like, the 2006 election, in the 2016 election in the USA. Like, every 4 years, America loses its mind, and it's entertaining as hell for an Australian. But after that, you saw, at least for me in the circles I observed, I saw a lot more people becoming a lot more familiar with these counter arguments they've never heard, or at least these arguments that were somewhat forgotten. Because, for instance, Trump's policies aren't particularly any different from what Australia has always practiced. And Australia has a good Gini coefficient, a highly multicultural society, and yet, like, are all Australians racist, or is there something more going on? So it seems like there's a struggle with people of, like, this kind of forgetting of previous wisdom, this exploration phase, and then kind of learning the hard way a bit from that experience. But at the same time, it's always based in these contexts, this contextual cultures. Like, the East are going through, like, for instance, there was actually an essay. One of the things I realized from movies is, like, when we watch anime or whatever it is, or Western cinema, the directors or the artists are wrestling with the problems present in the culture at that time. So there's a essay channel called Pause and Select, and there's a movie, Akira, and Akira focused on society with individuals representing abstractions within larger society. And then we have the Neon Genesis series. That really focused on the individual as society, this existentialism framework. And then we had this whole thing called YKK, which focused on achieving harmony within the everyday. However, toxic harmony emerged in the society, which is the new challenge of society. So for instance, they started having domestic terrorism, like train bombings, things like that, where the desire to suppress the conversation 10 years ago, this toxic harmony actually started causing severe problems, or even in the ways of dealing with the tsunami, it was a thing of where there was flaws that were never communicated because they were terrified of offending the harmony of the company or the harmony of the family or the harmony of the culture. And now the media from Japan or from the East, a lot of that is now wrestling with how can we overcome toxic harmony and integrate this traditional respect of roles and culture and family, but with this respect for the individual. And from the West, it's doing it the other way around, which is really interesting. But
yeah, I mean, there's I right. Do you need to finish? Do you have something? I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the only other thing to add in that, just another part of the economic morality is like veganism. Like the only reason we're seeing a surge in veganism today is because of supermarkets, which is now it deprives us of the necessity of killing an animal. And now it's finally for the first time optional to do that with nutrition. So now the veganism is now this thing which everyone has heard, but if you're still in cultures in many places throughout the world where you're still struggling day to day for nutrition, like many places in Philippines, it's cultural for them for someone's birthday to slaughter a pig. Why? Because if that could be the only time in that entire year where they have the taste of meat, where they are nutritionally adequate. So there is trying to convince them to adopt veganism is a fool's errand. That is misapplied morality. So it's interesting where like this Western notion of veganism is dependent on this cultural or this economical framework where it's now possible.
So there's quite a few topics in that series of thoughts. I think if we're going all the way, like I'll try to go back, take it from the beginning, I guess, in terms of just responding to some of these things. The idea of exploring new spaces using certain kinds of economic structures and the types of personalities that are attracted to different phases of that exploration cycle. I mean, I think you touched on the disagreeableness. I think that's definitely a huge part of it. I think if we're going to talk in the language of Big Five, you can't forget about openness as well in terms of the role that it plays with respect to people wanting to move or stay at the frontier of whatever their domain of interest might be. And that domain of openness is actually much more equiprobably distributed across between the genders than disagreeableness, which trends male. So that, I mean, that's an interesting, you would then also potentially expect to see that if you have certain kinds of spaces, like for example, a strict hierarchy, you model a business as a strict hierarchy, which the initial, most of the initial corporations, the word of the root etymological root of corporation, the same as corporeal, corpus, which means, it's the body, right? It was modeled on an idea of the body. The executive suite is essentially the mind, and then the rest of this corporation is the body that enacts the will of that central mind. Highly centralized, very much in extremely rigidly hierarchical, idealized structure. And that's encoded in the law as well. But a lot of this is also changing. I think one of the things interesting about crypto is that there's an explicit move towards decentralization, right? And when another word for decentralization is flattening, or there's a lot of ways to talk about this or think about this. But if you then also overlay this psychometric profile on top of this pattern towards decentralization or flattening, you then also start to see that there's a lot more opportunity for those who are hyper open, but perhaps not hyper disagreeable, to also be in the very early phase of this. And so you do see a much stronger, or much more balanced selection in many ways in terms of like men and women in that space than you do in the traditional tech space, for example, and the sort of downstream companies that came from that traditional tech space, at least in my experience here in San Francisco in the crypto world. which has been interesting. I think there's also, there's interesting considerations in terms of what that means for organizing direction. Like if you look at just centralization versus decentralization as organizing principles from an evolutionary perspective, centralized hierarchical structures tend to be better at short-term agency and movement with intention, but they tend to also succumb in the long term, oftentimes to lacking the correct information to stay on a particular path, and so they'll sort of like fall off a cliff over time. Whereas decentralized or flat or whatnot types of structures tend to suffer from more drift across time, but don't necessarily have the kind of short-term agency. It's a lot harder to make sense of the world and decide what to do in a decentralized structure. And so there's a lot more talking and a lot less doing, which is an interesting mode of being.
Is efficiency and robustness a fair map there in the trade-off?
Yeah.
Like
you could say
almost
robustness,
choosing
resilience.
between efficiency and robustness.
Yeah. I mean, it's like the decentralized like resilience, right? Because like resilience maps to decentralization oftentimes in a way because you sample from more parts of the possibility landscape, right? It's not one, like if the whole company is just the functionary of one mind, if that one mind makes a mistake, the whole company goes off a cliff. Same with the dictatorship, authoritarian centralization, right? And it can be very efficient and it's relatively low cost as long as everybody's willing to play the game, and as long as you're willing to sacrifice a lot of those things over time in terms of like let them die, right? And this is how evolution's done it as well. We're also getting to a point where we can no longer really oftentimes afford to play that game at the scale of society.
Right.
We kind of got a hint of that with our democracy, right? Democracy is the first step towards this, but it's still very hierarchically structured if we're really going to talk about it. So yeah, that's this whole interesting, like within all of that context, then we have to say like now there's this other aspect that you were speaking about, which was the East-West divide and the different perspectives that we've brought to the table, and how those cultural backgrounds parameterize this. The Western philosophy versus, I would say, like largely, a sort of downstream flow of Confucianism, in terms of the real strength, the real leaning towards. I mean, I don't know, this is a very complex topic, so I'm sure like, there's plenty of people who are going to scream, whatever. But like, obviously Taoism has some roots, and I would argue Taoism actually strikes a much more nuanced balance between individual and collective than does Confucianism, which was not only it was pretty explicitly order oriented and order from a top down or centralized perspective oriented, and harmony in the sense that you're discussing earlier as well. It's like the idea, like the phrase you said, that was quite interesting, toxic harmony. That was kind of fascinating because we might need to pick it apart a little bit in the sense that it's like it's not exactly that harmony itself. Like it's hard to understand what harmony being toxic means, but you can certainly understand what it means to create toxicity as a side effect of pursuing harmony at all costs, right? Like no tolerance for disharmony or ultimate fear of disharmony generates like toxic waste, and that toxic waste actually might be more likely to like create disharmony in the long term. Like that might be interesting. I mean, I don't know. Like, what do you think about that?
Yeah, it's pretty fitting. Like we see this as well. I spent about a year of my life living in Kuala Lumpur, and they're a nation that was occupied. And one of the things we come to find about occupied nations, and this is from my friends who were KO, I asked them they just put up with anything. It seems like they'll get the wrong order. Sometimes they'll complain, but it's more like in terms of institutional battles, they just accept it. But like me as an Aussie, like I came to realize I was just like, this may be one of my first times because in Indonesia, white means wealth. When in Kuala Lumpur, white seems to mean annoyance, right? Because it means I'm going to complain, this service isn't what I expect. You screwed up my order. What are you going to do about it? When like they just went for them, I asked one of my friends about it, and they said, we are a meek and we are a meek and I don't know. We are a meek people who are afraid of questioning authority. And it's interesting because this comes into the economic morality vibe as well, which is that it was not economical for them to question authority when you're an occupied nation. That gets purged. So it's interesting.
Ah,
But
that
now,
was
like,
the other thing that we definitely didn't. That was the one thing that
yeah,
we didn't touch on. Again, the morality economy dichotomy. That yeah. Sorry.
yeah,
Keep going. I just wanted to like
yeah,
put a pin in that.
yeah. Well, that's the thing. Like, it's just something that seems to be the case. I mean, like, that can be because I want to do that as a paper because there is a whole amount of research I've done over the years in a non-academic way to seem to back up that theory, and I'm looking over the years to partner with more academic-minded people to try and flesh this out and see if it can be turned into a paper as a proof or a disproof of that idea,
Mhm.
just because it seems so fascinating. So I'm not if we can rive on that some more. We've gone on quite a bit. I think maybe we can. I think that's probably quite good. One of the other last things to tie in. Have you heard of Eleanor Ostrom? Sorry. So she won a Nobel Prize in economic sciences for showing that the tragedy of the commons was just a myth. It wasn't actually tested, and that it actually turns out that emergent ways of dealing with resources cooperatively actually come to fruition. I've got her books. I'm hoping to go through them through with the Bevry reading group. It's really, really fascinating. There's a lot of work going into this. And yeah, I think we could probably talk for hours upon hours. I think the bonds
Yeah.
there will just get there. Is there any closing points we want to make?
Well, I mean, I would just say like on the Ostrom point, just a very
Yeah.
quick. I think that the connection between the tragedy of the commons and Ostrom runs through something like Taleb's. And I don't necessarily agree with a lot of his way of communicating, but he does have some ideas that are worth thinking about. One of them is the sort of symmetry argument with respect to skin in the game, quote unquote. So it's like to the extent emergent systems are able to have a meaningful relationship with a shared commons that is not distanced by other economic abstractions, that tragedy of the commons dynamic doesn't emerge. I would probably argue to the extent that we create abstractions that distance us, like you're talking about the supermarket idea, to the extent we distance ourselves from the phenomenological side effects upon a commons, we are more likely as a collective to turn those commons into tragedies. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and so that's one of the things she talked about, which is that one of the important things of that type of self-governance is a direct relationship to the consequences. And that's one of the reasons why self-governance is really important, because it returns that thing for relationship to the consequences.
Yep.
I think I've kept you guys up long enough.
Yeah, should probably eat something and get some sleep.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you so much for Matthew for participating. I'll reach out with you with opportunities for follow-up collaboration and conversations. I think there's so much we can talk about and benefit from. I hope that feeling's mutual.
Definitely. I'll give you my email via Twitter, and then just share around the people who are on the call's contact information, because I would love to be in further touch with everyone.
Yeah. Right.
Awesome.
Are you part of?
And thank you so much for having me.
Great. And do you use Discord? Because you can join our Discord. Otherwise, I'll go via email and I'll do that route.
I have Discord. I don't keep it on constantly, but I do dip into it.
Alrighty, cool. So we can have like a little quick post-show chat, but I'll wrap it up for the live stream. So yeah, thanks so much, Matthew. It was an honor to speak with you. I think everyone thoroughly enjoyed it and valued your expertise and wisdom you shared. Thanks so much, Nicholas, for leading that conversation for the last majority of the conversation. I really appreciate that. Very fascinating. Tyler was right to recommend that. And thanks, Tyler, for joining. And thanks, John, for joining, even though he didn't get to say anything, but he helped me with it. He did have some input. I talked with him via text chat, and he's very pleased with it. I think it went terrifically well. And thanks so much for the viewer. You can learn more about Bevry in the description below at bevry.me. We're doing discussions like this every week to align our axioms towards truth. And we're building projects to help facilitate that. And it's going to be incredibly exciting. We have lots of great things in the pipeline. I'm so excited to be able to share that more and more as time goes by. If you want to join and be part of everything, you can join us via the Bevry Discord or via the forum. All the links will be in the description below. Alrighty, thanks to viewers, and please join us again next week. Now let me see if I can find the end stream button.